Look, I didn't choose this life, okay? This life chose me. Welcome in, everybody, to the reveal of the number 22 team in my preseason power rankings. As today, we take a deep dive into the Carolina Panthers, a team that snuck into the playoffs last year and gave the Rams a run for their money. Yet a team that not too many people are taking all that seriously this year. They are still the fourth place in terms of odds to win this division, for example. And this team, to be fair, has a lot still to prove moving forward here into 2026. So I'm excited to break it all down here today. If you enjoyed the video today, if you enjoyed the deep dive series, if you could do me a huge little favor and take just a second to hit that like button down below, a little football animation will pop up for you, which is fun. But more importantly, it'll go a long way, actually, towards supporting this series and supporting my channel, getting this video out to as many Panthers fans and NFL sickos just like you. And of course, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of these deep dives as we lead up to the number one team in my power rankings. But let's begin. As always, we go through every aspect of the team through the roster and the coaching staff and begin every segment by taking a look at their offseason changes and ask the big question, did they get better, worse, or stay the same? And in regards to the Panthers coaching staff kicking things off here, no change here. They are sticking by the staff that got this team magically into the playoffs last year. But let's further break down this staff underneath Dave Canales with Brad Idzik and Ejiro Evero still here as the defensive coordinator. And anybody that's watched this series knows I can come into this coach and scheme segment with some strong opinions one way or another. In the case of the Carolina Panthers, I'm pretty down the middle in terms of Dave Canales and these coordinators. I don't really have strong takes or opinions one way or another. I do think this staff has shown to be a very more than capable NFL staff that has obviously taken the Panthers from several years ago when Dave Canales stepped in 2024. This Panthers organization was the pinnacle laughing stock of the NFL at the time, above teams like the Cleveland Browns and New York Jets. And that's saying a lot. Look, I know they were. I moved to Charlotte that summer. You couldn't go out to a coffee shop or out to a bar and hear people trash talking Dave Tepper. I have the flag that I had in the intro, the 30th season flag. I was there when Bryce Young got benched and there was nobody at the stadium. Like, dude, the Panthers were a joke when Dave Canales took over, and he has very much raised the bar towards NFL competency. This hasn't been a great team. They've had a lot of roller coaster moments throughout the course of Dave Canales being here, and he still has a lot to prove and room to climb in the rankings. I have him ranked as the 20th head coach, but it goes without saying, the culture and just the professionalism in terms of the scheme and the play calling and just being a well-coached team from an X's and O's standpoint underneath Dave Canales as the prominent offensive mind here, every box has been checked. I'm not going to sit here and rave about Canales or Brad Idzik for that matter as like schematic gurus or act like I watch the Panthers and they're doing incredibly creative things and like raising the bar to the extent that some of the, premium NFL offensive minds have done around the league. I don't think we're there yet with Dave Canales, and maybe we'll never get there as this season he's actually passing play calling duties off to Brad Idzik, which puts some further eyes on the job that Idzik can do. Now, I do think one area with Canales that I at least wanted to bring up is I do think there was some points of frustration with the run game play action balance last year. And honestly, I know the Bryce Young haters don't want to hear this, but I do think there was a lot of points in the season last year where you were starting to hit a lot of green lights with the passing game, and Canales was still kind of keeping the offense bottled up. So it was kind of a combination of like, well, the offense actually in many games was better in the second half of games where they had opened things up and put the ball in Bryce's hands a little more and trust the passing game a little bit more, whereas they got themselves in holes with a run game that did have a lot of its ups and downs and some bad games last year. And then there was also just a lot of like predictable first down running with him, where I think leaning into trusting play action earlier in drives, in the downs and earlier in games, some of the just play calling, not the actual play design, I think is fine, but some of the decisions with what buttons were being pressed, the run pass balance at times did have its points of frustrations. And I think going to Idzik this year, it's something to keep an eye on if that improves, if it stays the same, does it even get worse with Idzik? It's a new wrinkle in an area that was a point of frustration at times with the Panthers offense. And that is also naturally like, if you're an offensive-minded coach and you're passing the play calling duties off and you've had some of these frustrations, that is naturally like gonna be a little bit of a footnote and a red flag on a coach's resume. So I do overall, like, I really like Canales and what he's done here and the culture that he's built, but it certainly has not all been rainbows and butterflies either. But just as far as the rankings here across the board, I think respectable is the best way I could put it. 20th at head coach in terms of offensive coach rankings, right in that middle cluster, ranking 16th to 23rd for pass game coaching with B- grades there. Same with the run game coaching, 14th to 23rd. The overall coaching culture is still building up. I think getting into the playoffs, being competitive against the Rams, even though this was an 8-9 football team that required a crazy three-way tie scenario, that required, I think, the Falcons to beat the Saints in week 18 to create that three-way tie. Like, the Panthers walked ass backwards into the playoffs, but they did show up and played against what many people viewed as the best team in the NFL at that point in time against the Rams and gave them an absolute run for their money as a double-digit underdog. They had the ball at the end with a chance to force overtime. So I do think in terms of like the Panthers coming into this year, acting like they were Pinocchio and now they're a real boy, like, the coaching culture is at a much better starting point heading into a season than it's been in a long time here in Carolina. So, like I said, every box is checked here. It's just a matter of, are we talking about Dave Canales and Brad Idzik as great coaches or just really good coaches? Time will tell, and this year is going to be a part of that story, certainly. Before I go to Ejiro Evero, who I also really like, I want to at least talk about what the Panthers scheme looks like here on offense. This has been brought over from Dave Canales, and Canales in many ways is a bit of a remnant of the quote-unquote old Sean McVay offense. So if you go back to when Sean McVay was kind of at first being risen to the top of our head coach rankings and coaching conversations, 2019, 2020, a lot of the talk was about how Sean McVay has taken the bases of a Shanahan-style offense, something we obviously talk so much about in this series and around the NFL, the idea of a play-action-oriented passing game that tries to marry the run and pass and make it all look the same. Sean McVay with the Rams really went and leaned towards being an 11 personnel base offense, which is going to be 3 wide receivers on the field, and really leaning into that as an idea compared to a Shanahan style offense that does like to lean into more 12 personnel with 2 tight ends on the field, heavier personnel, maybe a fullback on earlier downs. Well, McVay said, let's take a bigger wide receiver like a Cooper Kupp, for example, and run kind of 11 and a half personnel where that extra wide receiver can do some of the blocking duties, but it creates a little bit more athleticism and wiggle room for our passing game to expand things a little bit. And McVay obviously became known for that first, and now McVay has honestly gone back to the roots of heavy personnel and adjusted to more of a man gap inside run game at times. But Dave Canales has very much attached himself to the branch of the Sean McVay coaching world that came out from that 11 personnel era, most notably Shane Waldron, who came over to Seattle from the Rams in 2021, where Dave Canales was. Brad Idzik was there as well, and that's where Canales really adapted this Shanny McVay style offense as his own. And they had a ton of success with Geno Smith there. He goes to call plays in Tampa, gets the job here in Carolina. And throughout that path, the offense has very much looked like, I would say, a 2020 Rams offense, whether it was in Tampa last year, here in Carolina. The Panthers actually ran the seventh most 11 personnel in the NFL last year. So that's kind of the root of the Panthers passing game, is still a lot of play action, using those classic Shanahan style passing concepts, deep crossers with a alert post over the top, all those classics that have been well documented throughout the years as the Shanahan offense has become as prominent as it is. But as far as the run game is concerned, I do think Dave Canales has done a great job at evolving his offense from a run game perspective. Earlier on in Seattle and a little bit in Tampa Bay, they struggled to run the ball. They really did. And it was a little bit more predictable, just like pure outside zone, Sean McVay style offense. I do think Dave Canales has continued to kind of see what McVay is doing, kind of being that peak mentor for what his system can and should look like. And Canales has certainly added more of a north and south inside run game element to the Panthers run game, which has led to the most success Canales has had with the run game. It's actually been a huge part of the Panthers' relative success with guys like Chuba Hubbard and Rico Dowdle. And the Panthers have really settled in with a very balanced, varied run game. They had an almost perfectly even split last year in terms of outside zone versus inside zone versus man gap, more power-oriented run schemes. It was just over 100 attempts in all three of those different categories, according to Sumer Sports. So they have built a very balanced run game here. I don't think it's consistently taken over the league, and I think they've at times struggled to actually find the right balance between being too run-heavy and when to trust Bryce Young, and Bryce Young's consistency that we'll talk about has added to the struggle with that balance. So I do think it's a big year to go from, good to great, so to speak, for this combination of offensive coaches with Canales and Idzik here together. But everything is just very balanced, very professional, and certainly not going to hold this team back. More of, can they really project this team forward and maybe win the NFC South with authority this year instead of walking in ass backwards. Now, as we go to the defensive coaching side of things, I love Ejiro Evero, and I have defended him for years, at times against the voices of Panthers fans that have seen this Panthers defense under Ejiro Evero in 2023, in 2024, be laughably bad, like some of their metrics pushing historically bad. And naturally, you're going to point to the guy coaching that defense and say, well, obviously that guy's just not very good. The reality is this Panthers defense has been just completely deprived of talent. They've suffered injuries on top of it. And the fact that this Panthers defense has even had moments of competency is because they have Ejiro Evero. You think this Panthers defense was bad those 2 years? Good God, you would not want to see it without Ejiro Evero, who was viewed as a head coach candidate kind of before he got stuck here in Carolina. And now he's started to rebuild that sort of resume and appeal as, I do think, someone that if the Panthers continue to trend in the right direction as they have, as this front office, we don't really spend a lot of time breaking down front offices in this series, but just a quick shout out, like, those guys, Dan Morgan, shout out Eric Eager, friend of the channel. Dare I say, even David Tepper has settled down as being like the villain in Carolina. I think the last 2 years, this has been one of the best front offices in the league in terms of getting this team back to competency and giving Ejiro Evero actual pieces to work with. And last year, he had some pieces. This was not a super talented defense, but he at least had a Derek Brown, J.C. Horn, Mike Jackson, some actual foundational building blocks for the defense. And the Panthers were adequate. They were roughly the 24th, 25th defense in the league, and worse than that in terms of roster talent. I would still say bottom 3 or 4 in terms of overall defensive roster talent. Now, hopefully, even more pieces to work with. Evero can take an adequate roster and make them a good defense, would be the hope and expectation for how I view Ejiro Evero. So it is a big year for him to kind of reestablish that, like, call it benefit of the doubt or perception that I have of him as someone that can elevate a defense. And that is still reflected in my defensive coach rankings for the Panthers, where they get B grades across the board, 10th to 17th for pass defense coaching and 11th to 18th for run defense coaching. So definitely respectable rankings on that side of the ball as well. Likewise, I do want to talk about Evero's scheme here. And Evero definitely comes from that Fangio coaching tree. So in his ideal world, he's going to be in a pre-snap, two-shell coverage structure. The idea of that split safety, rotating safety defense that is the modern meta around the NFL, whether you're a Fangio disciple, a Mike McDonald disciple, or even a Robert Saleh style disciple. So much of the league is in that mentality of the create post-snap confusion with rotating safeties. That is very much the core philosophy of this defense, and just in line with those types of schemes, Vero and anybody that runs sort of a Fangio-style defense ideally isn't going to blitz a ton, but when they do blitz, use all of the different creative buttons you can to manufacture pressure. So whether that's causing pre-snap confusion by walking linebackers and defensive backs up to the line, create incorrect slides for offensive lines, create some of that phantom pressure that we talk so much about, you know, using loopers and stunts and all of that good stuff. You see a ton of that here in Carolina's defense, that even if they aren't blitzing, they're sending four, but trying to create some of those numbers advantages and, advantageous angles to help a defensive line that has not been, on paper very good at getting after the quarterback in a one-on-one sense, creating some advantage for those guys. So you definitely see that. One thing that does stand out to me about this Panthers defense recently is that, and this is pretty common for bad defenses, is that Evero has had to basically spam cover three. They ran 46% cover three last year. That's essentially what they've done in the last couple of years. The second most cover three ran in the NFL last year. And, cover three is the most common coverage in the NFL for a reason. It's a good high floor defense that is balanced in terms of pass coverage and run defense, getting some extra safety support. They've ran that much cover three because they've had to, simplify things, allow these guys to play fast. It has at times made this defense rather predictable. And I do think Ejiro Evero would tell you himself, ideally, we're not going to run that much cover three. It still might be our most common coverage, as it is for most teams, but let's see if we can go from 46% and maybe get to that league average of 32% cover three. Ramp up the amount of post-snap confusion we can cause by running more cover four, maybe more cover two, where they just were pretty low in terms of rates at those coverages. They did, as we've seen with Vic Fangio especially, but any of these, split safety types of defenses, the Panthers did run a lot of cover six to try to get some element of that kind of post-snap confusion. They ran the sixth most cover six last year, was kind of their changeup. But even cover one man, they were 29th in cover one man to man last year. Always a pretty good sign that the coaching staff just isn't quite trusting the Jimmies and Joes of the defense to hold up. And that's not an indictment, I think, on guys like J.C. Horn and Mike Jackson. I think that's an indictment of the pass rush and the rest of the defense to not be vulnerable against, man-to-man cover one types of looks. So I do think this is a big year for Ejiro Evero to be, show that he can get back to, diversifying this scheme a little bit, truly elevate this defense. And I do think he has the last couple of years taken, honestly, a historically bad roster, at least over the last 15 years. The Panthers roster in 2024 was up there for the worst you'll ever see. Last year, I think they were a very bad roster and ended up being just an adequate defense. Now, can we expand the scheme a little bit and see this Panthers defense ascend to being more top half-ish? I think would be a big step for Ejiro Evero. And if that happens, I do think we're going to start to see some head coach interviews and see him be a name that he already is highly respected around the league. There's a reason the Panthers kind of held him hostage when they were changing changing regimes in heading into 2024, and good thing they did, because Ejiro Evero is a big asset for this team, and hopefully we'll continue to be that here this year. So now that we've kind of set the table with this Panthers coaching staff being a very good, respectable, floor-raising staff, I'm excited to get into all of the aspects of this roster and where things could go this season. But before we get into that, another thing I've been really excited to get into this summer has been the World Cup. And Prize Picks lineups are the perfect pairing to keep you more interested in these World Cup matches and give you a chance to win some big bucks as well. With Prize Picks lineups, you're selecting more or less on any number of player stats. So if we're talking World Cup, you're looking at shots, passes attempted, so many different things I'm trying to learn about this sport as I watch the World Cup, but very much enjoying having Prize Picks as a part of that. You can also pick the winner for these games now in most states, including California, Texas, and Florida. So that's another great way to enjoy these games, of course. It's not just the World Cup. They have baseball and just so many other different options. Basically anything you could think of, they're on Prize Picks. They even have a social media element. You can follow along with my picks if you want. I don't know that I would trust my opinion on World Cup picks, but certainly once we get to the NFL season, I'm going to be really loading into trying to find some winners with these NFL matchups. That's going to be at TFG_football in the social section on Prize Picks. So big thanks to Prize Picks for sponsoring today's deep dive. If you sign up, use code HMA, and when you do, they will give you $50 in bonus lineups when you play your first $5 there. So thank you, Prize Picks, and let's keep going with this deep dive. But let's now get into this Panthers roster and just to kind of experiment with the structure of the deep dives here a little bit. Just a thought I had that, maybe this would be better to do it this way. I'm going to experiment with it, and with all experiments, I would love some feedback from you guys. Do you like it this way or the way we've been doing it? Just for this episode, before we get into the offense, I'm going to look at all of the offseason changes for the offense. Kind of paint that picture for this side of the ball for all of the moving pieces at once, and then we'll go position by position as we do. And then we'll do the same thing for the defense, obviously. But as we look at the Panthers offense, offseason for the offense, it was largely quiet except for at offensive line. So you look at quarterback, and, they did trade Andy Dalton to Philadelphia. Kind of a weird trade. I don't really know why Philly wants Andy Dalton, and I don't really know why the Panthers wanted to move on from Andy Dalton. I feel like he's been such a good, basically extension of the coaching staff and has worked really well with Bryce Young. So I didn't love that, to be honest. But Dalton did show pretty big drop off in his play when he did play this year. And then they bring in Kenny Pickett. So on the field, neutral at quarterback. I said neutral at running back as well. This isn't nothing. They did let Rico Dowdle go, who did give them a Linsanity style run of running back play last year, and then went right back to being what we thought Rico Dowdle was, as just an okay running back. So it's a moderate loss, but I am actually excited to talk about the addition of Jonathan Brooks returning here, their second round pick in 2024 that's basically never played for this team to this point, still just 23 years old, but said neutral at running back there. At wide receiver, they made some additions here, Chris Brazel II and John Mechie III. So we'll get into those additions here. Slight upgrades at wide receiver, but nothing major. Tight end room, no change. So pretty minor. And then you look at the offensive line and you're like, whoa, basically not an entirely new unit. There's a lot of existing starters still here. But a lot of moving pieces here. So you look at the losses. Cade Mays leaves in free agency to go to the Lions. Definitely a loss there. Austin Corbett had to step in with the injury to Robert Hunt last year and played okay, as Austin Corbett tends to do. Josh Nijman retires, and Brady Christensen not back here. Some depth pieces no longer here. And then kind of to be determined in terms of being a loss, Ikem Ekwonu is coming off of a torn patellar tendon that was suffered, I think was it the first drive of the Rams game? I can't exactly remember because admittedly I was at that game, which was electric, and I was admittedly not sober when I was present. So I can't remember exactly when it happened, but very late in the year, very serious leg injury. Reports of his recovery are somewhat optimistic. Around draft time, it was like, yeah, he's not going to play. Now it's like he might be back. So kind of to be determined in terms of how much they're losing from Ikem Ekwonu, who played 84% of their snaps last year. But those are your losses. And then you look at the additions. You get Robert Hunt back, who missed the majority of last season. That's a major addition, played just 16% of snaps. They get one of the budget free agent signing head scratchers around the league, Rasheed Walker, who I don't think is a superstar. We'll talk about him. But if Zach Tom gets 3 years, $20 million a year, Rasheed Walker should have gotten that and some, and he gets a 1 year, $4 million deal because they didn't think Ikem Ekwonu was going to be available and still might not be. Monroe Freeling, also a first round pick, just hammering that tackle room there. And then they sign Luke Fortner from the Saints, and they draft Sam Hecht in the 5th round. So pretty nice additions to complement what were some decent amount of losses for this team. Enough so that I do actually say upgraded further on the offensive line. So it was a good offseason for this Panthers offense, though this wasn't really where their premium focus was, especially through like free agency and stuff, as we'll see when we go to the defensive side of things. So let me know how you like that format for offseason changes. I think I like that better. But I could see the argument for either way. But with that said, let's get into the quarterback room in Carolina. And this is, of course, a very major 4th season for Bryce Young coming up. And he is one of the obvious wild cards of this Panthers team, is just what level quarterback play are you going to get from Bryce Young? And Bryce is a very polarizing conversation, right? He's one of the many players that have to kind of deal with the... I still wish I knew like the right name for this sort of phenomena. And I've talked about this in other deep dives, but the idea that like when someone disappoints right out the gate, or vice versa, if they break out onto the scene out the gate, like you're kind of fighting against that sort of bias against a guy or idea that the guy stinks, or like that first impression is what sticks with you the most. And Bryce Young is still very much pushing against the first impression that we saw on him, which was putrid, horrible, like unplayable, like benched in year 2 type of bad, right? And anytime he has a good game over the last year and a half, even myself, but I think most fans are still like trying to break through that barrier of like, we still saw what we saw from Bryce Young, you know what I'm saying? Whereas you look at like CJ Stroud in his draft class, realistically hasn't been as good as Bryce Young over the last 20 games or so. Yet, I think most people would still take CJ Stroud over Bryce Young, right? Because that rookie season was so good. I think we're seeing the same phenomena with like Emeka Egbuka last year, who was awesome for the first 6 weeks and then was one of the worst wide receivers in the league for the second 2/3 of the year. Everybody talks about him like he's awesome. And Bucs fans obviously are not going to like that in this Panthers deep dive, but I don't know. I find that kind of idea, that phenomena, interesting, the way players are perceived. But yes, Bryce Young is still kind of trying to beat the allegations that he was a bust, right? But if you watch in the last 20 games or so where things have really settled in, or even like year 2 when he came back from being benched, it's probably more like 25 games, if we're being honest. The majority of his second season, once he came back around week 7 or so. Really from that moment onward, Bryce Young has been at worst a like starting NFL quarterback. Someone who obviously like will have some games are better than others, but we haven't really seen that like unbelievable low floor from Bryce Young that we saw earlier in his career, where like the decision making was horrible, the accuracy was horrible, he couldn't extend plays, the blitz was just like he couldn't handle the blitz at all. Like he's reached a comfort level as an NFL quarterback that he doesn't seem to get like thrown off track necessarily in that sense, where like his play just derails games. And the Panthers are like uncompetitive because of their quarterback play. There's going to be some games where he can't quite elevate necessarily, or where the Panthers can't quite get things going. But typically it's, kind of the conversation you have with a lot of those like QBs like 18 to 26, where it's like, well, yeah, when you make things hard on this level of quarterback, typically they're not going to like uplift the offense and pull you through this thing. You need to give them a better infrastructure. And the Panthers' infrastructure's just kind of been a little all over the place still. It's all come in moments, but there's moments where the run game disappears. There's moments where the offensive line struggles. There's still been moments where these pass catchers just haven't quite been consistent enough. And yeah, you've had a lot of moments, a lot of games from Bryce Young where he's just been like, whatever, okay. But again, you've at least been able to look at him and say, well, he's stabilized his game enough that when things aren't good around him, like they especially weren't earlier in his career, he's not going to torpedo the game for you. And then you have the exciting games from Bryce Young. There was that Falcons game last year where he broke the Panthers single game passing yardage record. You have his first NFL playoff game in Charlotte against the Rams, against admittedly a pretty bad secondary, but a pass rush that was all over Bryce Young. And I think from a kind of macro view and like what matters most for Bryce Young, I think that Rams game was the most like glaring sign for optimism for Bryce Young. The fact that he, to me, did step up and play not just one of the best games of his career, but came back from a rough start where it looked like it was going to be that David versus Goliath matchup, the biggest spread differential from that wild card weekend, this fake playoff team, the 8-9 Panthers against the Super Bowl favorites, right? They fall down 10-0. And then Bryce Young said, no, we're not going to go down like that. And Bryce made a bunch of plays, whether it was extending plays, getting out of sacks, making throws on the run, hitting the back of it, hitting his top of his drop, throwing strikes on third and longs over the middle of the field where everybody says, oh, Bryce is too short to attack the middle of the field. That's always been an incorrect criticism of Bryce Young. He will attack the middle of the field, but especially in that Rams game, he was very comfortable doing so. And also beating the blitz was on his evolution in terms of beating the blitz was on full display in that Rams game. You can go back to, I made a video, I think it was in Bryce's rookie season called Breaking Bryce, with the Breaking Bad pun there. Kind of talking about like everything that's going wrong with Bryce Young and where he's really struggling. And one of his biggest areas of weaknesses that was like his fault, because there was a lot of other stuff as well that was making things harder on him. But one area that I really needed to see Bryce Young get better at was beating the blitz, knowing where his quick outlets were, just not like crumbling in the face of the blitz, just whether it's standing in there, taking a hit, or drifting in the pocket a little bit, but just having the confidence to put the ball out there on an out route or on a slant or wherever that ball needs to go, having those blitz beaters, recognizing the blitz, knowing when it's coming. It was bad. That was one of his weaknesses at Alabama, and it was even worse on full display against NFL defensive coordinators in that rookie season. But the Rams tested that against Bryce Young, and they got cooked against the blitz in that playoff game. And throughout the season, we've seen those big moments from Bryce Young really prove that there's not this like Achilles heel of a weakness, that when you play the Panthers, you can't just count on sending 6 guys after Bryce Young and getting that guaranteed stop on 3rd and 8 like it really felt like it was for those first couple of years. So that's been a big thing that I think has raised his floor in the sense that we've talked about. And I think a lot of that does just come back to like confidence and what I talked about with him playing so well in a playoff game, kind of building that momentum. I love the Pinocchio analogy for the Panthers, like coming out of last season as like, okay, last year was kind of a best case scenario for the Carolina Panthers. And the fact that they lucked into the playoffs was a dream for them, because I think just becoming a real boy again, the feeling that you belong can go a long way in a locker room. And for a quarterback like Bryce Young to really start to ramp things up even further, And I really do think the groundwork has been laid with Bryce Young, where his comfort in this offense, the ability to play on time, I think his accuracy has gotten so much better. They've done a lot of work with his footwork and stuff. He's always going to have unique footwork because he is a shorter quarterback that still wants to try and attack the middle of the field. So as far as like how he gets to his drops, like how he's going to be throwing, kind of trying to find that right balance with the tippy toes and that kind of stuff, it was debilitating earlier in his career. They've really worked with him, and I think now reached a point where they've got that right balance. Bryce understands who he is, the Panthers understand who he is, and now they can head into a big fourth season here and continue to kind of prove people wrong. I think the arrow should still be pointing up on Bryce Young. He's gotten better every step of the way. So far, he's still quite young. He's roughly the same age as Caleb Williams. He's younger than Jaden Daniels, Tyler Shuck in this division, obviously. But he turns 25 here just before the season starts. This is just a huge season for Bryce that, okay, maybe he does just settle as a guy who maybe his size and lack of like elite arm talent, I wouldn't say he's an elite athlete. He can definitely extend plays, but like maybe just can't always uplift the offense. Maybe he can be overwhelmed due to his lack of traits, and some games are going to look better than others, and maybe he settles in as like the 19th, 20th best quarterback in the NFL. But there's still some serious upside with this cat too that he needs to get credit for, as well, as things have started to shape up for him. I mean, he does still, to me, have incredible pocket presence, that spatial awareness, the playmaking instincts that were elite at Alabama as a prospect, the defining thing that made him the number one pick in a highly perceived quarterback class. Those traits still show up in there. I mean, he has that scrambling touchdown against the Rams that I thought was going to create an earthquake in Charlotte. Electric. His ability to create in the red zone and extend plays on third down, it's real, and his comfort to do so has really evolved over the years as well. Feels like he's getting out of sacks, navigating pressure better than he did earlier in his career, getting back to that Alabama Bryce Young much more. And it wasn't just last year. We saw that when he came back from being benched in his second season. And then the last thing I got to say about Bryce Young in terms of upside, you can't have a, however long this is, 10-minute Bryce Young conversation without at least bringing up how clutch this guy has been. He has admittedly been one of the most, if not the most, consistently clutch quarterbacks in crunch time. The Panthers don't make the playoffs this year without the amount of game-winning drives. The game comes, tie game, 4 minutes left. We either need to get in field goal range, put together a game-winning touchdown drive, or maybe you have the lead and you need a couple of big third downs to milk some of these games out. Really, throughout the course of the season, when those moments showed up, Bryce Young delivered time and time again. Some of his best moments, his best plays, and this goes back to later when he was reemerging in 2024 as well. The Eagles game comes to mind. Bryce Young has delivered in those moments. And honestly, one of the best throws I've ever seen Bryce Young make was in that Rams playoff game where they needed a field goal to force overtime. He throws a deep crosser to Jimmy Horn Jr. In the face of pressure that was a great throw and would have put them almost in field goal range with about 15 seconds to go. And he drops it. Jimmy Horn drops it. And that was the game. And it was just like, man, what could have been? Like, Panthers realistically had a chance to win that game. Bryce Young did his job. So that has to be mentioned with him. Like, he does have that like cold-blooded killer, like the moment's never too big for him. And that bakes into the equation with a Bryce Young. So I'm really excited to see what kind of level he can reach this year. I still have eyeballs. I've seen that Bryce Young isn't consistently playing like a great quarterback. There's been really encouraging moments of that. But I have him ranked as the 22nd quarterback with the Panthers here heading into the season with the up arrow on him. And of course, being a major wild card. I do think if the Panthers are going to continue to grow, continue to compete in the NFC South and edge out what should be a pretty tight race in this division, they need Bryce to continue to take a step and get closer to being more of a top I would say just solidify himself as a tier 3 quarterback would be great, because right now I think he's really flirting with that idea that he's kind of like, Brock Purdy would probably be like the easiest guy to look to be like, okay, yeah, maybe he's not the most elite quarterback in the world, but he's definitely a guy that you pay and is your franchise quarterback, and you're not like actively looking to replace that guy. I think Bryce is very close to that point, I think, in the Panthers' mind, in my mind, but he does need like another good year to continue to climbing to reach that point. And I think that level of quarterback play can be enough for the Panthers to win this division this year, but I think there is another step potentially in there with Bryce Young to threaten like a top 10 quarterback someday as well. But we gotta let's establish the tier 3 floor first, and then we'll see if that arrow continues to trend up for Bryce. Now, as far as the backup room, they bring in Kenny Pickett. I would expect if they have to go to Kenny Pickett, this team's season is over. He's established himself as a very reasonable NFL backup, but the Panthers are not a good enough team for a reasonable NFL backup to drive them anywhere further. They also have Will Greer here, and Haynes King deserves a shout out for his 40 time, basically. Will be a fun backup quarterback in your Madden leagues, certainly. But there is your quarterback room that obviously centers around needing a big year here from Bryce Young. But let's go to the next position group here, running back with the Panthers, where they rank inside the top 20, ranking 18th to 20th, but that is a drop off from where they were last year, coming off the heels of a massive Chuba Hubbard season in 2024, where Chuba was, to me, a legitimate top 10 running back. I think Chuba came back to earth a little bit last year, and certainly earlier in the year when Rico Dowdle was going nuts. Chuba, I think, got hurt for a little bit and kind of lost that job for a little bit until reclaiming it later in the year, showing a little bit more of that 2024 version of Chuba. So Chuba, for me, actually, gets that yellow arrow, where this is a big year and kind of a tough year to rank him. The last 2 years when he was a breakout in 2024, really, the last 2 years have looked very different. So what version of Chuba are we getting this year? That's a wild card in its own sense. I do think the best version of Chuba Hubbard is roughly a top 10 running back, someone with good burst, really good vision and patience, toughness, and like ability to pick up bonus yardage. Just a great locker room presence. Like, they really paid him because he was the first thing that like really went right for the Panthers in the Dave Canales era. And his kind of first one in, last one out mentality, just they love Chuba in that building. And there's a lot of reason to believe that, he could get healthy and get back to being that consistent kind of top 10 or so running back. Or maybe he got on a hot streak in a way that we kind of saw like with Rico Dowdle last year as well. And he was kind of the hot hand at the time and they paid him. And now he's kind of come back to be somewhere between what he was before that 2024 breakout and what he was after he broke out, obviously. So an 81 overall rating for me on Chuba Hubbard as just a very good, balanced, tough runner with a little bit of a sliding scale in terms of, okay, he's about the 18th running back in the league right now heading into the year. He could prove to be more close to 10. Maybe he's more 24-ish, which is, obviously close to what he was last year, if not lower than that because of the injury. But it's not just Chuba Hubbard that is a wild card for the Panthers this season. Jonathan Brooks is expected to make his return, and that is extremely exciting if you're a Panthers fan. With this new regime, Chuba Hubbard was never plan A. Jonathan Brooks was plan A to be the franchise running back here for the Panthers. He was essentially what they got for Brian Burns and a bunch of cap space that they used well, in my opinion. But that was basically the swap there. Brooks was a huge part of this idea that they were going to invest in the infrastructure for Bryce Young, and he hasn't been able to play here. He's been one of the most, kind of tragic injury cases in the NFL over the last 2 years, where he was coming off the ACL injury when they drafted him. And you can make the argument they should have been more careful with that. But that was roughly his draft range. Someone was going to take Jonathan Brooks in that range. I don't think it was a bad process for that pick at all. But he gets 9 carries after they were careful with him. They waited a long time to play Jonathan Brooks in that rookie season. He gets 9 carries with a minor flash in there. I think it was on a reception that year where you started to see that juice. And then very quickly they had to shut him back down. And he had to get surgery again on that same knee. And again, they show patience. They sit him out the entire year last year. So 2 years into his career, he's touched the ball 12 times. That said, he's 2 years into his career. He turns 23 in 2 weeks. This is such a great opportunity for a guy that is starting to get some pretty positive reports in terms of like, yeah, the injuries have sucked, but you know, it's behind him. He hopefully is in great shape, and he gets a great opportunity here from a team that didn't do anything else to try to roadblock his carries. They obviously have Chuba Hubbard here, but if Jonathan Brooks looks great, I don't think Chuba Hubbard is going to really stop them from ramping up Jonathan Brooks and making this a split carry situation, just as they did last year. You know, they had just paid Chuba Hubbard, but Rico Dowdle was the hot hand. They went to him. If Jonathan Brooks looks better and is more explosive and looks like the guy they hoped they were drafting, you have a beautiful transition into a new era with Jonathan Brooks. The opportunity here is wonderful, and it's best. Like, the best thing about it is you don't need Jonathan Brooks, but his upside's great. I compared him to Melvin Gordon, who was obviously pretty consistently a top 8 or so running back in his prime. The running style, the size, the burst, the vision, it all reminded me so much of Melvin Gordon coming out. Just kind of checked every box as a runner that you could look for. Might have been a first-round pick if he was able to finish that season and wasn't coming off the torn ACL. But anything you get from Jonathan Brooks is also house money. You need Chuba Hubbard to step up in that situation. But they're not hanging their hat on needing Jonathan Brooks this year either. So there's a lot of excitement in this Panthers running back room. I mean, if Chuba Hubbard gets back to 2024 Chuba, which isn't that crazy to see happening. He's 27 years old and got better as the year went on last year as he got more and more healthy. And if Jonathan Brooks is something close to a Melvin Gordon, you might not have this, like, you know, peak Saquon Barkley or Bijan Robinson level running back, but you might have 2 guys that are extremely dependable and like top 10-ish. That's an excellent running back room. That's a best case scenario. Worst case scenario here is one of the lower ranked running back rooms in the league. If Chuba kind of goes back to being one of the more bottom tier starters in the league, Jonathan Brooks can't stay healthy. Well, that obviously wouldn't be ideal for this run game. Especially because the backups, like, they're pretty thin. Like, you have Trevor Etienne, who can thank his brother for us getting his pronunciation correct moving forward. And I liked Trevor Etienne coming out of Georgia specifically as like a scat back, explosive, like pass catching threat. I thought his routes and his hands, when Georgia did decide to use him in that phase, which the words Georgia and knows how to use their pass catchers should never be put together in a sentence. And that applied as well to Trevor Etienne. But like, if they wanted to tap into him more in that sense, I think there's a ton of upside and juice there. The consistent run game ability is just, he's in this category of like speed threat, undersized backs that weren't really used much between the tackles in college, don't really have that experience. The best case scenario is like James Cook, who that's what he was as a prospect. And he figured it out, right? He bulked up, he developed his vision and became the player he is now. There's a much longer list of guys that don't turn into James Cook, but you know, I think it's pretty unlikely you get a good runner from Trevor Etienne, but I am interested to see what we get from him in the receiving game potentially. And he does some stuff as a returner that was more bad than good last year, but there's still potential for him there. So he'll be in the mix. He'll touch the football this year in different capacities, but I'm not expecting a big year from him as a rushing threat necessarily, though it's possible that he takes the James Cook developmental path. And then you have A.J. Dillon, who's honestly like one of the most frustrating running backs to watch run the football. He has stuck in mud. Like, it feels like there's quicksand on the turf behind the center every time A.J. Dillon touches the football. It's painful. And he's 240 pounds, but for no good reason, because you need acceleration to generate power and fight for tough yards. And A.J. Dillon, you would not expect him to go down as often as he does on first contact because he just has no momentum. That said, he is actually a very good third down running back and deserves credit for that, as much as he's kind of ticked me off watching him try to run the football in a Samaje Perine-esque role, where Chuba Hubbard's just been okay in the receiving game, and as a pass blocker, Jonathan Brooks entirely unproven there. Trevor Etienne's got explosiveness, but not much of a pass blocker. If you just need someone that can pass protect, hang in there, and then also be really good as a check down option, that's where A.J. Dillon does his best stuff with the ball in his hands, is when 180-pound slot corners and cornerbacks that seem to be getting lighter and lighter these days try to get him to the ground. They just can't do it. That's where you actually do see power from A.J. Dillon. So I wouldn't be stunned if you get some injuries here. If A.J. Dillon is catching some passes here and has some moments, you do not want to have to lean on him as a runner, though. So there is your backfield. It's a very fun group with a ton of upside. I mean, we mentioned the best case scenario with Chuba and Brooks hitting their upside. What if Trevor Etienne hits his upside too and is actually a third piece on top of this that maybe doesn't see the ball a ton but is extremely dynamic when he does? There is a very fun path here. But right now they come in ranked, pretty middle of the league. 18th to 20th for running back, B- grade that could go up or down, certainly. In a lot of running back rooms, I say, like, they're solid. It probably won't derail this team's run game one way or another, even if they don't rank all that high. There maybe is more of a worst case scenario with this Panthers run game where they come out of this year and it's like, man, we really need a running back. Like, especially in the case of Chuba, kind of if he's sort of regressing and unable to kind of get back to form. So we'll have to wait and see, obviously, how it all goes with the running back group here. But let's go to these pass catchers in Carolina. It's a very fascinating conversation here as well. And another position group that does absolutely get that wild card ranking, and kind of likewise, a B- grade, 23rd to 27th. It's a solid group that you're really hoping can hit some green lights and be a big part of the Panthers taking that leap forward from fun Cinderella team to legitimate factor in the NFC. And this is another case, by the way, that I have done some tweaking to the formatting. This is more of just a graphics change here, but something that I really wanted to do that I've gotten a lot of requests for. So shout out to you guys that are always giving great feedback for this series. I've modified this graphic to show the sort of overall grades for the tight ends that includes their run blocking grade. The way we kind of discuss these guys and the conversation isn't going to shift too much there. But definitely let me know in the comments down below if you like this change or if it's, maybe harder to follow and you prefer the old one or whatever. I want all the feedback, always trying to make this series progressively better in any way that we can. So let me know there. But let's get into the Panthers pass catchers here. And it's really, to me, we hinted at the possibility of upside and that kind of thing. There's some little pockets of it scattered throughout the depth. But it really comes down to T-Mac and Jalen Coker, who are both, I think, on the precipice of being a really great 1-2 punch. Maybe not, we might not be talking about top 5 or elite upside necessarily with this duo, but this has not been, and this includes T-Mac from his rookie season where he rightfully won Offensive Rookie of the Year. But in terms of reliability and consistency, while we like the direction the Panthers pass catchers has been headed, this has been a point of frustration in a lot of Panthers games. So you're really looking at T-Mac and Jalen Coker, who they themselves, whether it's availability in Jalen Coker's case or drops and not always being the contested ball catch winner that I think he can be in T-Mac's case, this is a big year to go from fun, exciting young duo that has a lot of promise to no, they're the guys. They are there doing it week in, week out. So let's start there with T-Mac. And I already hinted at it, so let's discuss kind of the areas for improvement. And then I'll wax poetic about, honestly, one of my favorite players in the NFL that I was kind of obsessed with, and found a way to be even higher on T-Mac in the draft than most people. But as big of a T-Mac fan as I am, you have to keep your eyes open and realize, like, okay, he still had a lot of drops. 7 drops last year put him at 8.5%, perhaps showing up as more of a question mark than I certainly had on him as a prospect. And the contested catch win rate, while he had some batshit crazy, incredible catches, as we know he's capable of, that's probably the most obvious glaring selling point on a guy like T-Mac. But he was incredibly inconsistent at it. The highlight reel of winning tough catches looks real nice, but he only came down with 8 out of 24 charted contested catch opportunities, 33.3% after being close to a 60% guy in college. That's the area that if that just comes up a little bit, and I fully expect that it will, because of, his ball skills are tremendous, whether it's his size, his ability to contort and elevate for the ball, to track the ball. We've seen it. And his reel of catches in 2 years at Arizona was one of the best you'll ever see. I know it's in there, but it's a little bit of that, like when Kyle Pitts has struggled, it's like, we need to see it come back. And it's just 1 year of T-Mac. We're not in panic territory like we've been for Kyle Pitts for obviously it eventually happened for Pitts last year, but you know how that story has gone with him. But you don't want that to be the case with T-Mac, right? Where we go through 3 years and it's like, where's Arizona T-Mac? Why are you only making crazy catches once every 4 or 5 weeks when we know you're capable of consistently doing that? So that's having that consistent dog at the catch point. Getting that this year would go a long way. And naturally, let's lower that drop rate a little bit. Now, starting with the most negative aspect of the rookie of the year is going to make it sound like you're pessimistic about his outlook. That's far from the case. I mean, as long as he can clean some of that stuff up in an area that I know the skill is there, this dude's special. Absolutely special. Just a rare blend, almost an impossible blend of size and athletic ability. And I do go back to what I said about him as a prospect, where to me, he is the best worlds of Mike Evans and Drake London. Both of those, like, super high drafted, like archetype number 1 big bodied wide receivers, but both have been kind of capped by certain physical limitations, whether Drake London doesn't really have that long speed that a Mike Evans has. And Mike Evans is much more stiff and one track as an athlete, and has his shortcomings in terms of diversity of route tree and run after catch ability that Drake London thrives in. If you fuse those two guys together and painted what could be the best case scenario, that's Teteroa McMillan. He has that crazy frame and ability to win incredible catches like a Mike Evans and Drake London has, but he also has the speed to create vertical stack, to pull away from guys on crossing routes and after the catch, to really be a mismatch problem in that sense. And he has the savviness, the shiftiness, the change of direction and stop-start ability that Mike Evans doesn't have. Like, he is a legitimate threat after the catch to an underrated sense. And it also shows up in his ability to snap off routes and separate, especially in the intermediate game. Like, there's very few receivers already in the NFL that are better running digs and out routes like T-Mac is. And he's got finesse to his game. Like, he has shoulder fakes and will push off at the top of his route. Like, he knows how to separate, and that's only going to get better. The sky is the limit for T-Mac. I said earlier that the Panthers' weaponry maybe doesn't have like top 5 upside. That's more of a Jalen Coker thing. T-Mac himself can be one of the best wide receivers in the entire NFL, and I still have no doubt about it. And obviously got off to a pretty good start as well, finishing with 1,100 yards, 1,200 rushing yards, 1,000 yards passing. That's a pretty good start. And obviously got off to a pretty good start as well, finishing with 1,100 yards, 1,200 rushing yards, 1,000 yards passing. That's a pretty good start. winning Offensive Rookie of the Year, finishing strong, playing excellent in that Rams playoff game. Really just a special young player that if he can really lock in, could be one of those dudes in the Puka, Jefferson, JSN category of wide receivers as we discuss those players. And then there's Jalen Coker, who is primed for a really important year with all this, whether it's Panthers wise, Bryce Young wise, Jalen Coker wise. He's a big pivot point for the Panthers' weaponry, season, pass game, you name it. And especially after the Panthers really showed us how much they believe in this guy. They gave him a 3-year, $35 million contract that honestly could age like fine wine. If Jalen Coker reaches, a level of consistency and becomes something closer to what one of my pro comps on him was being Adam Thielen, a year from now or even this year, paying him $11 million a year to be a really good number 2 wide receiver could be an incredible bargain. One of those like pay him before he breaks out types of contracts. And it's a testament to the undrafted free agents out there, a reminder that while you got to work for it, if you earn that role, you get your money quicker because it's only a 3-year contract as an undrafted free agent. But Jalen Coker does still have to come out and prove that he's worth it. He's got to prove, number one, that he can stay on the field. He's had some unfortunate injuries kind of be roadblocks to his breakout, I would say. He missed about a month in his rookie season just as he was starting to earn those opportunities. And then last year, he missed about half the year before coming back and finishing really strong and really a slam dunk for his season with a clutch career performance against the Rams. 134 yards on 9 catches, just a beautiful over the shoulder red zone touchdown. But Coker emerging as this team's dependable number 2 wide receiver is extremely important. And I do think his durability is going to be a big part of that because there's just very little from his play on the field that would tell you he doesn't have it. Like he looks exactly like he did at Holy Cross, but to make that jump and look that way at the NFL level says it all. Like he obviously dominated at Holy Cross and playing at that level is what made him go undrafted, but he has excellent hands. He's come down with 74% of his 19 contested catch targets. That's unbelievable. That is the definition of physicality at the catch point and ball tracking and having strength at a good 6'2.5", 210 pounds or so. There's a lot of like Michael Wilson to his game in that sense, but I do always just come back to the Adam Thielen comps with him as an undrafted player. But not just winning contested catches, he has just 1 drop in each of his 2 seasons on 99 targets at this point. And he's got fancy footwork to get off the line, to win on slants. There's not a ton after the catch. There's not a lot of like vertical juice or anything like that. But if you go back to the scheme conversation for a second, and this team wanting to be, for the most part, an 11 personnel team and having that big bodied slot wide receiver most of the time, giving Jalen Coker the Cooper Kupp role, yes, hell yes. Again, not quite as dynamic after the catch. Probably not quite the run blocker that Cooper Kupp was in those Rams offenses, but you can ask Jalen Coker to do that and open up that window to the he is the key to running an 11.5 personnel style scheme here that I do think ideally, especially with a tight end room that's not great, as we'll talk about, that's the world that Dave Canales wants to live in, and having Jalen Coker settle in consistently in that role, the Cooper Kupp role, the Jawan Jennings role, would be such like, I just can't understate how critical that is for everything this Panthers team needs and wants to do, not just schematically, but having that dependable guy to move the chains, make tough catches for Bryce Young. So those 2 guys, the biggest of years heading into year 2 here. And honestly, all arrows are pointing up in that sense. They just have to go out and execute it. Now, after those 2, this is also, an even bigger reason why I say there's a little bit of a relative lack of like real upside. Like the top 5 groups of weapons in the league, you look at it and it's like, not only do they have an awesome 1-2, but they've got a 3 and a 4 and a 5 that you're excited about as well. That's especially with the Panthers where it's like, oh, okay, like we need somebody else to really surprise us, honestly, and step through here, because the receivers, like, opposite of dependability here. You have Xavier Legette, their first round pick, that at this point has been a bust with just very minimal flashes. Supremely talented, big, long, fast, you name it, has made some tough catches for this team at times, but honestly, like, just the inability to trust him to be in the right place at the right time, to get his feet in bounds, to secure the ball, like, it just, dependability is a giant red cross that with Xavier Legette. You know, the upside and the theoretical ability speaks for itself, but I haven't done this before. I put the hot seat icon that I use for coaches, I put it on Xavier Legette. Like, it's put up or shut up time, and there's a pretty good chance we don't actually see too much of Xavier Legette, barring something clicks for him, right? And because Xavier Legette is like on such a short leash here, it does make sense that they drafted Chris Brazzell in the exact same archetype. You could argue it doesn't make sense because they're signing up for basically the same experience, but because the upside with a guy like Xavier Legette or Chris Brazzell is so enticing, you understand trying to take some dart throws. And I'd much rather take that dart throw at the end of the 3rd round as they did, or the middle of the 3rd round as they did with Chris Brazzell, than trading up into the 1st with a guy like Xavier Legette, right? But Brazzell is the exact same idea. That vertical threat, when you're calling your play action shot plays, he's the guy that you're hoping safeties have to respect, or, you know, he can create that vertical stack. And I've even had to remind myself, like, Bryce Young, he is a good vertical thrower. He has an underrated arm. It's not a great arm, but he, you know, this isn't like Tua Tagovailoa. Like, he can drive the ball downfield, especially when he's got a clean pocket. And at Alabama, when he had like Jamison Williams and those guys, like, he loved to push the ball downfield and stretch the defense. They just haven't had a guy to do that with here in Carolina. And they've tried to do it with Xavier Legette, and he just leaves Bryce hanging half the time, right? So they want that part of this offense. Very much like that idea of like a Christian Watson in Green Bay, for example, in a similar style scheme. They want that piece. And Christian Watson was actually my best case pro comp on Chris Brazzell because he comes with all the same stuff. Tall, long, fast, but also crazy athletic movement skills for such a long, speed-based player. This isn't just a Marquez Valdez-Scantling or what I said about Dante Thornton. Like, Brazzell actually, especially when you go back to his Tulane tape, you can ask him to run snappy routes and change directions and gives you a little bit more after the catch. Tennessee didn't ask him to do that, but you can from an athletic standpoint. I would say Brazzell is even more athletic than Xavier Legette. He's just not as big, but I'll take that trade-off because it's not like Xavier Legette really uses his size to his advantage anyway, so you can drop 20 pounds off of that and get a guy that's even faster and separates better. Brazzell does, though, just come with extremely frustrating inconsistency issues. It really is just like some weeks at Tennessee, he looks like Randy Moss. Other weeks, he looked like Marquez Valdez-Scantling and Xavier Legette. So that's your 3rd round dart throw. You're hoping between the two of them, you can get that field stretching vertical threat, right? And that in its own right becomes a big wild card for this team because it could happen. It really could. But there's probably a 60, 70% chance that it doesn't. And you end up with similar frustrations where you just don't know any given week. Not if the guy's going to get open deep, but if he's going to catch the damn ball. But you kind of drop both those guys into that bucket of your Z wide receiver, your vertical Z in this offense. And then another area for some interest in this receiving group is John Mechie being reunited with Bryce Young. I can't spend too much time here because John Mechie has just had a rough go of it. Literally, he had cancer early in his career. He's now been traded around the league. I don't think Houston really did him any favors, like opening up opportunities for him to earn playing time. And I think that kind of led to him sort of going from interesting 2nd round pick to very quickly like your journeyman types, right? And the biggest opportunity John Mechie got was with the Jets and whatever infrastructure that was last year. So there really hasn't been much of an opportunity for John Mechie, but it's hard not to go back to his time with Bryce at Alabama. A couple of years ago, I was saying the Panthers should trade for John Mechie when they had this graveyard of a wide receiver room, because Mechie was Bryce's glue guy when he got into scramble drill, or if it was a critical third down, Bryce would scramble and Mechie was the guy that would read out, defenses, work back to Bryce Young. They had that chemistry that does matter. You see with like Mahomes and Kelsey. I think Josh Allen and Stephon Diggs had this. Like, there is just something that can click with a wide receiver and a quarterback in those situations, and Young and Mechie have it. So if Leggett and Brazel really struggle, you're going to have an opportunity for John Mechie to be the Z. And would I be stunned if John Mechie becomes like a pretty decent part of this as kind of like a Romeo Doubs-esque receiver here? Not to keep coming back to the Packers thing, but some of these skill sets and the way they've kind of constructed these receivers does kind of remind me of the Packers receiving groups of old. But yeah, I got to keep an eye on that, right? So that's kind of your top 5. And then you're probably still going to open up some opportunities for these other names to compete. You can't keep all these guys, but like Jimmy Horn Jr., still a fascinating young prospect that can get open and theoretically can return kicks and punts. Didn't do it super well last year, but did it very well in college. It's going to be hard for him and the Panthers to shake the drop that he's going to be known for that until he's not, right? That was a brutal moment for him. But just one moment, hopefully short memory, he can bounce back and become a more dependable, like he's got slot wide receiver potential, but just very unproven at the NFL level, obviously. Bryson Tremaine, like he is your Jalen Coker insurance plan. I think they could probably keep him on the practice squad, but Tremaine's like 6'4". He plays that like big slot Cooper Kupp role. So like as long as Coker's healthy, I imagine Tremaine's just a practice squad piece. I don't think anybody would pluck him, but he's existed in that role and like done some stuff. And then honestly, David Moore is getting older, but he's that vertical threat. Like if you do reach a point where Leggett and Brazel are so frustrating, David Moore could probably step in and still do that. That's about as deep as I want to go with the wide receiver room. Then you have your tight ends, which these guys are just okay. Like Tommy Tremble's going to play the most. He's the best run blocker of the group. And to Tremble's credit, I questioned that contract when the Panthers gave it to him because I didn't think his run blocking was consistent enough to justify like a guy that doesn't really have receiving instincts at all, like giving him a decent amount of money and like reinforce him as your blocking tight end. I do think he's progressed in that sense and did impress me as a run blocker last year, and they're going to continue to lean into him as in many ways, like if we keep comparing this to the Rams offense, is like he's your Tyler Higbee. You don't throw him the ball a ton. He doesn't necessarily drop the ball when you do, and he's had some moments after the catch. He's just going back to Notre Dame. Tommy Tremble has been extremely frustrating because he's the definition of one of these guys where you just say, why are you not better than you are? He's athletic. He's developed into a full-size guy. And it's not like he drops the football. He's won 67% of his 18 career contested catch targets, yet he makes like 2 plays a year. And the rest of it's just whatever. I've never been able to really explain Tommy Tremble as a football player, but at least the blocking has reached a more consistent level and you're content with him with where he is. And then you kind of got these other 2 guys. They're going to be in the mix, both from a rotational sense, depending on the down. And if they want to get into 12 personnel, you're going to see some combination of these 3 tight ends, really. You got Jatavion Sanders, who's half wide receiver, half tight end. They've bulked him up, and he wasn't really comfortable bulked up. He's had drop issues and just hasn't been able to kind of get back to what he was at Texas, which was a pretty just balanced receiving tight end. But he is kind of a weird player where he's not really a full-size blocking guy. He's not really a fast mismatch tight end. He's kind of just caught in between. And maybe that's just where he is as an NFL player, as just a decent backup. that you don't love the blocking on. So that just kind of leaves you hard to get that guy playing time, honestly, unless you become a more consistent ball winner. And then Mitchell Evans is very much in that archetype, like Y tight end, full size guy, good strong hands, made some good catches for the Panthers last year. He's going to play and trend up. I wouldn't be stunned if by the end of the year he kind of overtakes Tommy Tremble and then Tremble becomes more of your move blocker. That's probably the best case scenario there. I don't see a ton of upside with these tight ends, generally speaking, one way or another. James Mitchell might make this team as a fourth piece there. But that does round things out. I'm not going to go back through these running backs who, outside of Trevor Etienne, I don't see these guys making a massive impact in the receiving game. But that does conclude our conversation on this group of weapons. Definitely easy to see why I put the wild card icon on this team and why they are such a pivotal factor for this team. Just raising the floor with T-Mac and Coker, and then a bunch of other names that you want to see carve out roles and some level of contribution to this group. But I do just keep coming back to the consistency, like week in, week out, cleaning up drops and being in the right place, the right time, and being available in Jalen Coker's case would go a long way towards Bryce being more consistent and this Panthers team being viewed in a better light, obviously. But let's get to the last unit on the offense, the offensive line. Going to be the highest ranked unit on this Panthers team. And even after all of the offseason shakeup, I really like where this offensive line is at heading into the year. I even said they upgraded on paper heading into this year compared to what they got from the O-line last year. And this front office has really done a good job valuing offensive line, finding value on the offensive line, and continuing to replenish this group that has honestly gone through a lot of names. But more often than not, we've seen good offensive line play here in Carolina over the last 2 years. But this is a bit of a newer look offensive line compared to what they were last year, obviously, with all the shakeup. So let's break it. Let's break this newer look unit down. As far as the rankings are concerned, let's get that out of the way off the bat here. So I do have the Panthers as my 8th overall offensive line. So inside the top 10 there, and better from a pass blocking standpoint, where they rank 4th to 6th. And then run blocking still very good, ranking 15th to 16th there. So that's a really good starting point here. And let's go through this unit the way I like to do, just go left to right. So I do anticipate Rasheed Walker will be their week 1 starting left tackle. He brings the floor at left tackle, where Monroe Freeling is the developmental rookie, and Ikem Ekwonu, I would be stunned if he's available week 1. Though it's technically not impossible. We did see that type of recovery from Josh Simmons for the Chiefs, had a similar injury and fell in the draft and then ended up being able to be ready for the Chiefs early. So it's not impossible with modern medicine, but I'm expecting it's going to be Rasheed Walker, and then I'll talk about the other 2 guys at left tackle, I think, after that. But I don't have a ton to say about Rasheed Walker. I mentioned earlier, like, the contract was an insane steal, and I'll stand by that because he's a really good pass blocker. He gets in people's way. He's got a decent anchor. I would say the anchor is where he struggles the most. Just play strength in general is not the biggest selling point on Rasheed Walker, but pretty good footwork, pretty good technique. He's just been a very reliable pass blocking left tackle who unfortunately really does struggle to figure out in the run game. I think the play strength is an issue. I think just okay athleticism. A guy that just doesn't necessarily have the biggest mean streak, I think, which does matter if you're going to be a good run blocker. So you're going to get that trade-off with Rasheed Walker. And that's a big reason the Packers ultimately were looking to move on from him over the last couple of years, right? They like the pass blocking, but the Packers have been a very run-oriented team, and they got tired of having one of the worst run-blocking left tackles in the league. So that's what you're getting in Rasheed Walker. It's a big reason, I think, why his price tag was cheaper. These coaches love run blockers, as you should. But the pass blocking certainly became underrated when you look at a guy getting a 1-year, like $4 million contract in this economy. That was one of the biggest surprises, if not the biggest, out of free agency this year. So he immediately raises the floor where you have questions with these other 2 guys. Ikem Ekwonu, obviously coming off the injury, but even he himself he's a good player, right? I think he's stalled out in terms of like, is he a $20+ million a year franchise left tackle for a guy that's just been pretty solid as a pass blocker and very good as a run blocker, which was not a surprise. But, he was the 6th pick in the draft. He was supposed to be, he really was at the college level, a Trent Williams-esque run blocker. Like, you were hoping to get something like that, one of the better run blocking tackles or overall linemen in the league, and then someone that would hopefully develop into a pretty good pass blocker. And I would just say he's whelmed when he's played. Not a liability, not a problem, but he hasn't like skyrocketed forward like a lot of these top tackle prospects have. And then you add the injury into the equation and the fact that he's in the contract year and he's kind of stuck in limbo right now. When does he play? Does he play left tackle? If and when he comes back this year, does he miss the whole season, which is definitely a possibility to consider here. There's also the path where maybe, and it would probably require an injury. So like you obviously don't want that to happen. But maybe Ekwonu's long-term future is as potentially an elite guard. And again, that's more of a long-term pathway. I don't think you're kicking Lewis or Hunt into center. Maybe you would. Maybe those guys are veterans enough to handle that. Or maybe, Hunt did miss a lot of time last year. Offensive linemen get hurt. If Ekwonu's healthy, but you're not starting him because you don't want to rock the boat or you don't know how healthy he is, maybe an opportunity for him to start at guard comes up and we get that, get those tires going. But again, he's kind of stuck in limbo. We'll kind of have to just see what happens. They're obviously not counting on him. They put their chips in Rasheed Walker and most of their chips on their first round pick here in Monroe Freeling, who was a really good prospect, in my opinion. He was actually my number 2 tackle. Someone that I think the average or median draft fan was not a big fan of Monroe Freeling. Just doing mock drafts and stuff, there was kind of a negative response when you gave him to teams. I disagree. I really liked him as a tackle prospect. I think his pass blocking tape was excellent. And, someone that was newer to playing time at Georgia, but definitely looked the part in terms of length, technique, hands, feet, anchor. Like for a tall tackle to have the anchor he has, that's typically the problem with these kind of like towering tackle prospects with a lot of length is guys get up and under you and these guys haven't physically developed yet. And you see that like knockback effect from the anchor and the bull rush. I think he anchors pretty damn well. He just needs to learn to cut off inside counters and be a little bit more accurate with his hands. But I think his pass blocking was excellent. And from a run blocking standpoint, he was inconsistent. He missed assignments and fell off blocks because of his height. But there's a lot of high-end plays with him as a run blocker, and it's pretty easy to see how he could develop there. There were a lot of similarities with him and Colton Miller as a prospect coming out. And with the right development, you could absolutely get a franchise left tackle, a two-way pass blocking and run blocking franchise left tackle like a Colton Miller here. And you don't need him to be that right away, which is a really good place to be, especially with Walker on a one-year deal and the questions with Ekwonu. So they've kind of taken that trident fork in the roads, lay it all out there, choose your own adventure, if you will, with the left tackle spot. And it's honestly, it's hard to argue with. Like that is a strategy just to one way or another, like they're going to be fine this year with a signing like Walker, and they could be great long-term. And then, all right, I said I was going to go left to right, but I think we should probably bounce actually over to right tackle with Taylor Moton because it all ties together. There's been some conversations about Moton maybe playing out this contract that he signed, I think before last year, and then calling it quits. That's all just kind of silly, stupid rumors, and it's hard to know for sure. He's 32 years old. He's got one more year after this where he'll be 33, obviously. If that's the case, it makes a ton of sense that they would kind of really want to keep the pipeline coming with a pick like Monroe Freeling. Who knows though? Something could change. The Panthers could start winning a bunch of games, and Moton could be like, "Hold on, this is really fun. I don't want to retire." And he sticks around for a while because Taylor Moton's been Taylor Moton. Like, he is locked and loaded every year. He's kind of this team's version of like Jake Matthews that we talked about, where he's been there, he's been consistent. He's not the most dominant tackle. Like, you're gonna see some losses, but he's an excellent pass blocker, and I would say Moton's an even better run blocker than Jake Matthews. I think he's got better play strength than Jake Matthews. So like, you're locked and loaded with top 10 right tackle play as long as he's out there and as long as he wants to play. But obviously, like, if Rasheed Walker if you're happy with what he's given you, Freeland could maybe be the long-term Moton replacement. If Ekwonu comes back and wants to keep it up at tackle, maybe he's a long-term Moton replacement at right tackle. You have like different pathways beyond the 2026 Panthers season to ensure quality tackle play. And I really do commend that as a strategy. Not any tackles after those four names worth mentioning. Stone Forsythe has played, much to the dismay of whatever fan has to watch him play, but he has played. And that's really your tackle room and depth. Then I guess, yes, we'll slide inside. And at both your guard spots, I mean, the conversation can be pretty short. I mean, Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt were signed together in the 2024 offseason, and they've been slam dunk signings. I mean, obviously, Robert Hunt got hurt last year. There's nothing the Panthers can do about that, but he's been everything they were hoping he would be when he's played. And Damian Lewis has honestly gotten even better here in Carolina. I think his pass blocking has gotten better and better and better and better, like incrementally every year since he came into the league, where he was horrible to start. But it's actually reached a point where Lewis maybe is better than Robert Hunt, even though Lewis got about 2/3 of what Robert Hunt got in free agency. And Hunt is an example, I think, of a guy that was protected a little bit by the Mike McDonald system that's very beneficial to offensive linemen and not allowing a lot of pressures and like grading out well and that kind of stuff. Hunt in a normal offense hasn't been quite as good, but he's still been a very good piece. Both these guys are big, massive maulers. They're a big like complement to the Panthers running a lot of inside run game stuff, because these guys can move you off the ball. But yeah, there's no reason to believe these guys are going to get hurt. And you should feel really good about those guys at guard. And that can kind of be the end of your guard conversation. The biggest question is going to be at center, but this is another situation where I like the sort of pathways that the Panthers have laid out. I would have preferred that they found a way to keep Cade Mays, who I think is a really underrated signing for Detroit, and I would like this group even more with Cade Mays, but I like the pivot to a Luke Fortner for what he is as a weakest link. I think he's fine. And, he really struggled in Jacksonville. As a third-round rookie, he started the first 2 years, and he just wasn't very good. But because he wasn't good, he kind of gets benched. He moves through the league. He goes to the Saints as a backup, and then Eric McCoy, as he tends to do, got hurt, and Luke Fortner stepped in and played his best ball. And the Saints' interior offensive line had their issues. Luke Fortner occasionally was a part of that. But at large, it was those guards getting demolished while Luke Fortner was holding his own. And I think with his experience, he's a decent enough Band-Aid at center for now. There's theoretically some upside that things have really clicked for him, because I think he played above this 70 overall mark that I've got him at last year. But I don't know. I still think he's pretty physically limited. And eventually you're going to want more of a centerpiece. And maybe that can be Sam Hecht, who I wouldn't be stunned if we get through training camp and they're like, actually, Sam Hecht is the best center and he's going to start, because he had just good tape. He was one of my favorite center prospects in a class that had, for me, a big cluster of just decent potential starting center options. And I just thought he checked a lot of boxes. I thought he was a decent athlete, decent footwork and pass blocking. I thought he had a mean streak in the run game. There's stuff to like there's been far more surprising day three centers emerging as decent starters in the league than Sam Hecht. So I think it's a bit of a competition with Fortner getting the jump on that. But between the two of them, I do think the Panthers will get pretty damn decent center play. Probably not superstar potential with either of those guys. But when the rest of the group is as good as they are, it's a weak link position, and I think they can avoid having that be a liability of a weak link. Then you have really just like developmental athletic depth behind that. Sadiq Charles, Chandler Zavala, Jatiri Carter, all these guys have played a little bit and it's been rough. So if Lewis or Hunt do get hurt, you might have some more questions, because especially if Ekwonu isn't ready to go. Freeling, I don't think you want to, at his height, I don't think you want him to step in and play guard. So you are probably, in some pain if a guard goes down. Something to at least keep in mind. But that does wrap up this offensive line that's in really good shape. Not a perfect unit, but relative to the rest of the league, there's a lot of offensive lines that would benefit from the floor that I think this picture paints on paper here for the Panthers. And that wraps up the offense. So you put all this together, and where does that leave the Panthers offense? I have them 24th as we head into the year, which I think makes sense kind of with where they were coming out of last season. Still, obviously, you look at quarterback, wide receiver, and some questions at running back as your areas of upside, and probably still not like top 10 electric upside with this Panthers offense, but continue to take those strides as we've seen. Can we get to 15th as a Panthers offense? That's a reasonable, positive outlook for this team, and it also goes without saying they are very balanced as an offense as well. Having the foundation of the offensive line that they have is certainly going to help there. But they came in ranked 23rd for passing game and 24th for run game. And I think they have kind of largely equal paths to like get better in both categories as well. But let's now go to the other side of the ball with the Ejiro Evero's defense here. And like I said, we are changing the format here so that we are going to look at the entire offseason change for the defense. And then we'll break the roster down position by position. But it was a pretty exciting offseason for the defense as well. And when you paint this whole picture between the offense and the defense, no unit got worse on paper, in my opinion. And especially with some of these groups on the defense, you did make some very notable upgrades. You do start at interior defensive line, which stayed neutral, in my opinion. They say goodbye to A'Shawn Robinson, who was a nice rotational veteran kind of run stuffer piece, and they drafted who you hope to be a nice run stuffing piece in the second round in Lee Hunter. And in time, hopefully Lee Hunter can prove to be an even upgrade there. But to expect that in year one is a lot to ask of a second round pick. So I just said neutral. At least for now, on the interior of the defensive line. At edge, definitely upgraded, right? They go and make a major splash addition of Jalen Phillips, who we're certainly going to break down in depth here very quickly with the defensive line. It is an upgrade for sure. You spend that much money, you damn well better hope it's an upgrade. But I will say, to call that reckless spending, in my opinion, on what Jalen Phillips has been as a player and what his injury history has been, a 4-year, $120 million, $80 million guaranteed contract for this player. Look, even as a closet Panthers fan, I didn't really like that. But again, it's an upgrade. Just comes back to, was it worth what you paid him? We'll continue to get into that. They do get Patrick Jones back, who only played about a month last year before he got hurt. They gave him a decent amount of money in free agency the year before. It's not the biggest addition, but it needs to be brought up. And then DJ Wanham also leaves. So that's probably a push. But yeah, upgraded with the Jalen Phillips ad. And then at linebacker, upgraded there as well. One of the value signings of this entire offseason as well with Devin Lloyd. $14 million a year off the year he just had in Jacksonville. Especially at a linebacker group that has been abysmal to say the least in Carolina. So that's great. All their losses was Christian Roseboom, who was okay for what they needed him to be last year. But you'll take the upgrade of Devin Lloyd. They also spent a 7th round pick on more of a special team developmental piece in Jackson Kuwatch. And then in the secondary as well, all they really did was added through the draft. They didn't lose anybody of note, but Will Lee in the 4th round, decent 4th round pick. Not enough for me to say upgraded to any extent at cornerback for me, not to any notable degree. Technically, you have more than you had last year on paper. But at safety, I did say slightly upgraded, even though Zakee Wheatley was a 5th-round pick. I thought that was a phenomenal draft pick that I'm excited to talk about. And I did say slightly upgraded at safety. But let's begin this defensive breakdown here with the defensive line. A bit of a polarizing defensive line here for the Panthers in a handful of ways. Number one, I think this is a very one-dimensional defensive line, or call it a polarizing one, in the sense that they actually rank tied for first in D-line run defense. These guys are vanguards at the point of attack. However, they rank closer to the bottom of the league in pass rush, 29th to 30th for pass rush, and a lot to prove in that sense. And you tie this together, they rank between 20th and 24th for my overall defensive line rankings. Still definitely trending in the right direction, but needless to say, from a pass rushing standpoint, we've got a lot more still to see from this unit. So they're volatile in that sense, being kind of really good in one side of the position and kind of bad in the other. But also volatile in the sense of, like, you do have a lot of boom or bust qualities about that pass rush. And I'm going to start there with these two edge rushers, which are just massive wild cards for the success of this defense, both Nick Scorton and Jalen Phillips, for different reasons. We'll start with Jalen Phillips, that massive free agent addition that I mentioned. I love the Panthers front office. I know some of those guys personally, and I love essentially everything this team has done. This is not a contract I can really understand. I even if you could guarantee me Jalen Phillips is going to stay healthy, which you simply cannot. He's been one of the more injury-prone defensive linemen in the league since he came into the league. And that's not to dunk on Jalen Phillips, but it's just true. And honestly, it's not even since he came into the league. He was an injury-prone prospect. He had a plethora of injuries, including a very dangerous record of concussions, where he was advised to medically retire, comes out of retirement, goes back to Miami, and salvages, not just salvages, I mean, he broke back through, was an awesome prospect, great start to his career, but he tears his Achilles in 2023, tears his ACL in 2024, battles back from that, stays healthy at large last year, but was a guy that the Dolphins traded for a 3rd-round pick. Was not someone that the Miami Dolphins, in desperate need of edge help, was really willing to commit to long term. And the Eagles, who were desperate for edge help, they wanted to give him about $20 million, and that was a lot. But they weren't willing to match this type of money for Jalen Phillips. Howie Roseman's smarter than that. And the Eagles go and make a better value play for probably a better player, and Jonathan Grenard, honestly. To give Jalen Phillips 3 years of legitimate guaranteed money, and to give him as much as they did when the Panthers, because a big part of them replenishing this roster has been spending a lot of money in free agency, they aren't exactly swimming in cap flexibility. The downside of this contract is potentially debilitating to their team building capabilities. If he gets hurt again and is unavailable, and you are cap strapped to him for the next 3 years, the downside potential of that terrifies me. And that's just the injury thing. Like, I also think it goes right back to our last deep dive with the Commanders with the Odafe Owe contract, that, like, okay, I get having to spend more to fill a position that's been such a desperate need, and it's not like he's a bad player, but Owe got a whole $5 million a year less than Jalen Phillips. I think those guys are very similar players in the sense that, okay, they're good players. They're going to help your pass rush. They're like solid number 2 types of pieces. They're decent level kind of Robins, if you could have a Batman, that kind of idea. I like the Phillips defends the run. I'm again, he's not a bad player. He was a pretty solid impact for the Eagles. He's got a good bull rush. He's got some lateral agility. He's good with his hands. It's not that he won't help you, Panthers fans. I understand that. It's just, it's easy to be optimistic about a signing like this in the offseason before things play out. This is the definition to me of a making a deal with the devil type of deal, where the risk is probably going to outweigh the reward, even if the reward is appetizing to you. And with that said, all I can say now is, like, just please stay healthy, Jalen Phillips. Like, please stay healthy, because I think a healthy Jalen Phillips is probably about a $20 million a year player. He's like a Josh Sweat level, like good number 2 player. He's going to get you probably around that 50 pressure, 7 to 10 sack range, defend the run. I don't think he's as good as he was pre-Achilles, pre-ACL. I do see a guy that he doesn't quite have that first step, crazy power, crazy twitch. I don't think that's coming back either. I think he's a player at 27 years old that's settled back into a new version of his game that is a pretty good player that is now dramatically overpaid and injury prone. But that's your starting point. And the fact that is a wild card that we're just going to have to see if he can stay healthy, that speaks for itself, right? You don't need me to explain that for a fourth time. You get it. But then you have Nick Scorton, year 2 rookie, who I really loved as a second round pick. He was someone I was comfortable with as like a late first, and they get him in the second. Was a really great draft pick. I would say his rookie season was exactly par for the course for what I expected from him, from someone that was really a fan of Nick Scorton. But the caveat there is my pro comp on him was George Karlaftis. I do think he's a guy that at the end of the day does have some physical limitations. He doesn't have like incredible first step power. He doesn't have great speed and bend. He doesn't have like, how often do I say that traits matter if you're looking especially for like a legit number 1 edge rusher? They really do matter, but it's not like Scorton has no traits. They're just good kind of across the board. And his technique is very good to the degree that I think George Karlaftis is a best case scenario. If you could reach that here in year 2, that's still an upgrade from what he was last year and like a dream, like great outcome for what Nick Scorton is. I don't think he was that player every week last year. I think he's still developing. He's still relatively young, obviously. So like, I do think like another step from Scorton is certainly in the cards for him in year 2 to be an even more consistent pass rusher, for the playing time to, like, by the end of the year, Scorton was a full-time starter, for example, but it took him a while to get there. He was hurt coming out of camp and had a little bit of a ramp up. So just like the sheer volume of Nick Scorton's play should go up at least a little bit. I mean, they were leaning on him pretty heavily by the end of the year. So he still, including that playoff game, did play 773 snaps last year. But, he ended up 5 sacks, 10% pressure rate, and I think showed all the good stuff he showed at Texas A&M, where he's a technician, man. He's really good with his hands. He's got quick feet for a bigger guy. He's got decent pop in his hands and power. He can move around a little bit. He's got a kind of bevy of different ways that he wins, but he's not really dominant in any one category. Very much back to the George Karlaftis thing. Like, traits matter so much at this position: speed, get off, power, bend. Like, and again, I think Scorton's decently bendy for how full-sized he is. But you reach a point where it's like, you're probably not going to be this dominant number 1 type of player. Hence why he goes in the second round. Like, I feel very good about Nick Scorton's trajectory and where he can land. He still needs to take that final step to be proven as that sort of like Robin style number 2 level edge rusher, like a George Karlaftis. Not to like just beat a dead horse there, but it's one of my favorite like pro comps over the last couple of years. And I think year 1 put him on that trajectory. And obviously, like, if he can get there and Jalen Phillips can stay healthy, you can reach a point where that's a very functional edge room, especially compared to where the Panthers have been at. You're still missing that like dominator, the guy that's going to command double teams, the guy that's going to take over games and make offensive lines sweat and all that. The best pass rushers in the league are always on the hunt for. But you can start to at least build a competent pass rush around those 2 guys if, again, Scorton takes another step and Phillips can stay healthy. But that's not a proven commodity, and that is the best that this pass rush has to work with. When you start to talk about the rest of the pieces here, and I'm going to go to the interior D-line, you're still just left wanting a lot more. And yeah, 29th to 30th sounds harsh for a D-line that's, for Panthers fans, you're going to look at this and be like, hey, man, for where we've been, I'll freaking take that. Najero Evero will absolutely take this. But you start to compare, as we go through this series, you start to compare this D-line to all the other D-lines. It's like, yeah, most defenses have more to work with than this. And the interior of the D-line, especially from a pass rushing standpoint, does leave a lot to be desired. And I'm going to start with Derek Brown there. I don't want to say a bad word about Derek Brown. I hate to do that. I love Derek Brown. I will consistently defend him as one of the underrated players in the league. It's just, the reality is, he's not anything special as a pass rusher and really never has been. He butters his bread being maybe the best run defending defensive tackle in the National Football League. And he gets an elite run defense grade for me, right? And he is the prominent reason, obviously, that the Panthers are tied for number one in run defense. There's some other stuff to like. I think the edge rushers are good against the run that we talked about. You've got some other pieces that we'll talk about, but it centers around Derek Brown. Like, this dude's run defense, chef's kiss, man. He's a badass. He can split double teams. He's got different, ways to slip off blocks and make plays in the backfield and be a penetrator. They'll use him all over. He can play nose tackle, 4-eye, 3-tech. He's great for their 3-4 odd fronts because you can literally just put him anywhere you want, wherever you think it's most advantageous. But the reality is, as a pass rusher, it's so frustrating to watch Derek Brown because you want him to be so much better and more consistent than he is. And it's particularly frustrating because there are little moments throughout the season where he'll just dominate. Usually it's the Chris Lindstrom matchup where he just, like, for some reason, I don't know what it is, but he just turns it on against Chris Lindstrom and has made him, I'll say it, he has made Chris Lindstrom his bitch for like 2 years in a row now. And it's quite entertaining to watch, but he just doesn't do that against everybody. And I've tried to boil it down to like what it is. And I think two things stand out to me when I really watch Derek Brown tape. Number one, he just hasn't been able to put together, and part of it is he's just not that twitched up. Like, he's just more big and strong than he is like highly athletic, but he's a decent athlete. But he just has really struggled to put together, honestly, like the bull rush, because that's going to be the base of all these great interior pass rushers. Brown struggles to put together that combination of first step, the speed to power, ability to uncoil and get on top of his guy quickly. He's struggled to put that together, and like, honestly, his hand placement. Like, you'll see when he wins on a bull rush, it's when he does strike those hands inside, but just something about it. It's almost like a run blocker that, like Chris Paul, for example, on the Commanders, like, theoretically, he's athletic, but he just can't really figure out the moving forward run blocking side of things. There's some of that with like Derek Brown, where it's just like he just doesn't connect often enough as a baseline for his rush. And then, yeah, he doesn't really have this like diverse set of rush moves on top of it. He doesn't really have the athleticism to have a cross-facing swipe move or a spin move or all these other different ways to win. If he's not consistently leveraging that bull rush, there's just not enough there. He's not a bad pass rusher. He's a good one. He's pretty consistently been about a 35 to 40 pressure type of player. And if you put that into like an ideal situation, that's like a number 4, right? And it's just one of these tough balances where, like, I freaking love Derek Brown, right? Like, he's worth every penny. I can sing his praises all day long. The run defense is like a real thing here. But you see a superstar player like that, and you just, when they're that one-sided as a player, it needs to be brought up. So like, he, in many ways, like is a factor in terms of the pass rush just not grading out that high. It's like he needs to be this alpha piece on this D-line. He's not as a pass rusher. Hopefully, though, like, in a best case scenario, Jalen Phillips stays healthy. Scorton can become, the 1B or, 2A or however you want to call it on this defensive line. What I'm getting at is the last couple of years, Derek Brown has continued to have to be the guy. And hopefully this year he can at least be the 3, right? With Scorton and Phillips settling in as better pieces than that. But then even after Derek Brown, it's those 3 names that we've talked about and essentially nothing else. And that plays a factor in the pass rush not being graded as high. You don't have the depth and diversity of ways to get after the quarterback that a lot of defensive lines have. Let's stick with the interior here because there's still some starting names to talk about, like Bobby Brown. Love what he brings to the table as a rotational run defender. I do. And him next to Derek Brown is awesome. That's a big reason that the Panthers D-line rank as high as they do for the overall D-line run defense, right? But he is a one-trick pony. He is everything we said about Derek Brown with the dials turned down about 70%. Like, really stout run defender. Nothing has ever clicked for him as a pass rusher, despite him theoretically having the power and decent athletic ability to be that guy. It's not going to happen at this point. He is what he is, but he's a part of the rotation as a D lineman. They do have Tershawn Wharton. Pretty egregious overpay there too, unfortunately. Like, he's here because they can't really cut him. They gave him a 3 or $45 million contract. Basically, and again, Panthers front office, I love those guys, but it was probably a kind of panic button pivot after Milton Williams kind of screwed these guys over, right? They thought they had Milton Williams, and God, I wish they did. They lose out on him, and they're like, well, we have this big pile of money we're prepared to give to Milton Williams. Who's the next interior, undersized pass rusher that we can pay? And it was Tershawn Wharton, who, had a decent rotational role with the Chiefs as an undersized, undrafted guy getting to find space next to Chris Jones. You got to ask him to be anything more than that, and he can't really do that. He can't really play early downs. He just can't hold his own between the tackles. I think they're pretty eager to cut Tershawn Wharton. He does have some moments as a rusher. He's your second best interior defensive lineman as a pass rusher, though. And I'm not expecting him to give you anything close to what they're having to pay him this year. I'm not. Now, they did bring in Lee Hunter. I love Lee Hunter. I thought it was a value where they got him, but he is, again, one of these more run defense-oriented defensive tackles. I loved his run defense tape. His upper body, he's got a lot of Derek Brown to him where he is just strong as shit, and he can dispose of NFL caliber offensive linemen, or at least I project that he will be able to. He's got this unique lighter lower half. He's got a little bit of that like Tim Settle, Vince Wilfork always had that, where there's pros and cons to being so top heavy as a nose tackle, where your natural anchor is going to suffer a little bit. Like, if you get double teamed and combo blocked, you can actually give up a little bit of space, but it does allow him to stay lighter on his feet, which allows him to split blocks a little bit and gives him a little bit of quickness as a pass rusher. Not a ton. Like, I think he really struggles to get off the ball because he just doesn't have like the lower body explosiveness, and his upper body is this tank. But he can kind of win late as a rusher, like with hustle wins and kind of the same way you would win as a run defender, where you're standing up, stack, peek, shed, and then working off the block. He can do that as a rusher a little bit. He can't, quarterbacks will run away from him because he's pretty slow, but he can do some stuff as a rusher. But I do think in the mix as a run defender in year one, he's going to be another piece. And if nothing else, as a replacement for Ashawn Robinson, like, he can do that. I don't think he's going to really be a big impact rusher, though, if you're looking for that. Cam Jackson, another like run defense oriented guy that I liked, I think can get some more playing time this year. LeBrian Ray has been a bottom of the barrel, like rotational D lineman piece. Look, like, if you're just looking at the overall ratings, you're like, damn, they got a really good defensive line. But it's pretty much all run defense, right? And that brings you right back to, like, there's a lot of pressure on Scorton and Phillips to step up as this team's kind of 1-2 punch at the top of the pass rush pecking order there. And the edge rush depth is something you're going to want to look at too, especially with Jalen Phillips' injury history. And it's just hard to get excited about this edge depth right now. I like Princely Emmanuel. I thought he was a good, worthwhile investment in the third round. He flashed, just as he did in college. He flashed, but he's a guy that's got to take another step. And I don't know that I loved his ability against NFL tackles consistently. Unfortunately, like, he played in 17 games last year. He had 10 pressures. Now, he only had 144 pass rush snaps, and some of those pressures were very pretty with his bend, and, he's got some savviness as a rusher. I'm not completely giving up on him, but the fact that he can't play the run, he's not particularly fast, and he doesn't have a ton of power about him, it's just hard against NFL tackles to strictly win on the speed and bend when he doesn't really have the speed element. So you're left a little bit to be desired. I think still, like, if he could become, like, really develop, like, he's got a nice spin move, but like really develop the pass rush plan. Could he be like a Josh Martin, for example, or like what was it, Agbanya Okoronkwo, right? Just like a pretty decent number 3 as strictly a pass rush downs oriented player. There's still hope that he could be that, but that's just, there's limits to what that guy is, but maybe can make a little bit of impact. Patrick Jones does come back off the injury. Another guy that, I mean, I do think this team has largely crushed it, but their investments on the D-line have basically all been overpays other than Nick Scorton. Patrick Jones was a decent, like, 4th, maybe 5th piece on the Vikings, and they gave him a pretty hefty contract, almost $10 million a year for Patrick Jones. And as Patrick Jones tends to have, like, he had a couple moments in a 4-game sample size last year, but I'm really not counting on him, especially coming back from the injury, to give you too much. And, you know, they would have cut him if not for the fact that, okay, he's a $10 million cap hit this year, but they would have only saved about $4.5 million if they cut him. So it's like, well, we need edge depth. You know, $4.5 million, we're going to have to go spend that elsewhere. We might as well just keep him, but you know, he's a severely limited depth piece. Travis Gibson had like a good year, the Bears, but he's bounced around and is honestly kind of regressing at this point. You got some, like, you know, Nick Hampton comes over. He was with the Rams. Thomas Incoom, like, you know, basically depth dart throw territory. I just don't love the guys getting rotational snaps here, and certainly don't love what you're going to have to count on if you suffer the worst case scenario of a Jalen Phillips injury. I really don't want this to be this crazy negative conversation with this defensive line, because there is that really big bright spot with the run defense. And their ability to at least get to third down, where I think Ejiro Evero, with his blitz designs and the way that he can loop these guys and manufacture a pass rush, the ability to at least get to third down and have a strength on this defense of the run defense, it is something that does matter. I don't want to sell that short. This is one of the best groups in the league at playing tough up front, getting off blocks, establishing the trenches. But you are just lacking that juice and it factor still, I think, in terms of like getting off the field on third down. So that's where you're at with the defensive line. Let's go to the next level with a tremendously improved linebacker room. This has been probably the worst linebacker room in the league. And what do I always say in this series? You just don't be ass at linebacker. Don't be bottom 2 or 3 in the league. And the point where your linebacker room is like severely holding your defense back. And in 2024, it was unwatchable. Last year, it was like the fact that Christian Roseboom was a godsend for this team tells you where this team was at. Roseboom was at least a replacement level player for them. As Trevin Wallace went through his growing pains last year next to him. You bring in Devin Lloyd here, and that floor just comes way the hell up. And I love that. And to do that for $14 million a year, you just can't argue with that. And they desperately needed to improve this room one way or another. And they did that, obviously. So Devin Lloyd comes in fresh off the heels of an all-pro season. We've seen this now in the modern framework of the NFL. Being an all-pro at linebacker is, especially a second-team all-pro, is not the equivalent of being all-pro at pretty much every other position, because there's only a couple of elite linebackers in the NFL. So you just have to have one productive, really good season as a really good player, and you're going to be in the mix for the All-Pro award. The All-Pro of it does a little bit of heavy lifting. Like, Devin Lloyd is not, in my eyes, like one of the, 80 to 100 best players in the NFL, in my opinion, whereas an All-Pro would tell you he's top 50. You know what I'm saying? Like, I do want to get that out of the way. And, like Ben Solak, who I appreciate his analysis, pointed out, like, Devin Lloyd's a nice player, but like he's probably due for regression. Like he's probably not going to have 5 picks again. You're probably not going to get an all-pro linebacker, and that's probably something teams were thinking about when they gave him 14 mil instead of 24 or whatever, what was kind of projected for him. There's certainly truth to that, but he's still a really good player. And I think the biggest thing that stood out to me when I was studying Devin Lloyd this summer was the instincts. And honestly, those that followed the draft closely, it's weird to do this in reverse, but he reminded me a ton of Jacob Rodriguez, where he's not the most athletic guy. He's pretty big, but he's not the biggest guy. And he like from a run defense standpoint, there's actually a lot of plays where he gets caught up on blocks. He has a lot of missed tackles like a Jacob Rodriguez had. There's imperfections. And even with Lloyd, like as a coverage defender, once he matches up with a guy, he's not the most athletic guy to like lock down tight ends or be the most rangy coverage defender. But what really stands out about Devin Lloyd is just how savvy and instinctive he is. And it's a, you know it when you see it type of trait with Devin Lloyd. You can point to a lot of imperfections in his game. And honestly, I think the missed tackles with him is a concern. But like no screen gets past this guy. He baits quarterbacks and generates these hyper productive pass breakups. And he's got great ball skills. You can tell he's a football player. Like when the ball's in his hands, like this dude he's just a ball player. Like the jukes and the vision with him. Like if all your running backs get hurt, I would put Devin Lloyd in the backfield because he did some crazy stuff with the ball in his hands last year. And honestly, Jacob Rodriguez did the same thing. But I'm definitely willing to live with some of the imperfections in Devin Lloyd's game when you're not paying him an inordinate amount of money. And when you've been as desperate for quality linebacker play as the Panthers have been, they get a playmaking presence in the middle of their defense that they simply have not had. And he's also a very good blitzer as well. So a really good addition that just raises the floor from being in the gutter over the last 2 years. And then what can Trevin Wallace be next to Devin Lloyd? Wallace is the definition of the prototype for the 3rd, 4th round hyper athlete developmental linebacker prospect that I always talk about. Year 3 through 5 is when these guys tend to click. It's such a hard position to learn, and there's a lot of these raw guys coming out, and Wallace was absolutely one of them, but was a reasonable pick, and they've learned their lesson. Not that Brandon Smith was anything to really write home about, but the previous regime spent a 4th round pick on someone like Brandon Smith, forced him to play right away, and he sucked. And then they're like, oh, well, he's just bad now. We're going to release him. Now, it's not like Brandon Smith has gone on and had much of a career, but if you were going to have any chance with a Brandon Smith, it's what the Panthers have done with Trevin Wallace, where he doesn't play a lot early. He has to earn those opportunities, and you're a little patient. You live with what they lived with last year, which was a lot of ups and downs, especially in run defense. And you get excited about the flashes when they happen, and you try to really groom this guy, instill confidence, and now getting like a legitimate number 1 running mate next to him is a big year for Trevin Wallace. The run diagnostics have got to come along. He's been super streaky in terms of tackling consistency. But I do think from a coverage standpoint, we've seen a guy that has a lot of flashes and is tough to take advantage of from a physical standpoint. There's definitely still room for him to grow. And I think Devin Lloyd is one of the highest zone IQ linebackers in the league. I think he is going to be an excellent mentor for Trevin Wallace to show him like situational awareness, what he's looking for in certain zone drops. I really like that pairing. Wallace has real potential, real traits. You know, it doesn't always happen, but his tools, 72nd pick in the draft, developed the right way here. It is far, sorry for the double negative, but it's far from far-fetched, the idea that Trevin Wallace can be the next in this long line of, you know, the Dre Greenlaws, Alex Okereke, Foye Oluokun. I mean, this is kind of the model for most quality starting linebackers in the league, is exactly what the Panthers have gone through with Trevin Wallace. And hopefully you're now at the point where most of the growing pains are behind you. And you can start to get this to be one of the better linebacker rooms in the league. Now, that obviously depends on Trevin Wallace and his development. Right now, before we see that really come together, they come in ranking 15th overall at linebacker. They rank 19th to 22nd for run defense, but they do come in very high in terms of coverage because I think that's Devin Lloyd's biggest strength, and it's Trevin Wallace's biggest strength as well. And there's just not a lot of great coverage linebacker tandems in the league either. It's still just a B grade for linebacker coverage, but they rank 4th to 5th in the league for LB coverage, and I think the Panthers will take that. There's essentially no depth here. I think that's at least noteworthy. You got to keep these guys healthy. Claudin Cherelis has been an undrafted player that's played a little bit here as a backup. That's pretty bottom of the barrel, but at least he's played a little bit. Jackson Kuwach, special teams type of addition with, who tested well. You're not counting on him in his first season. You probably, if you have an injury here, you're probably hitting the free agent block, honestly, and trying to fix things that way. But we've started to create some potential excitement at the second level of this defense. And then you get to the Panthers secondary, which has really come into form as maybe not an elite secondary, but a very nice third level of the defense here that has started to really establish their own identity. And especially a pair of players that are certainly fan favorites for the Panthers. And one of the sort of foundational aspects of this defense is the cornerback duo of J.C. Horn and Mike Jackson, who has become one of the underrated players in the NFL. But before I dive into their skill set, I do want to at least mention the rankings here. So they come out as my 15th overall secondary. And honestly, as opposed to maybe the linebacker room or some of the offensive positions, I largely think that's about where they're going to be, assuming health. I don't see a ton of unexpected upside on the way with this Panthers secondary, but that's not to say there aren't potential areas of improvement and some guys that might surprise that we'll talk about here. But I do think with that cornerback duo, you know what you're getting at this point. You have two full-sized, instinctive, like zone corners that, the Panthers have run a lot of cover 3. These guys are sweet, dude. And I've praised this front office a good bit. Mike Jackson as a pickup for this team has genuinely been one of the better, one of those little trades that you look at and you're like, all right, okay, Mike Jackson for a future 7th. Okay, they got a backup corner. Who cares? No, they got one of the better number 2 corners in the league in Mike Jackson. And I guess we're just starting with him before we talk about J.C. Horn. But yeah, dude, his size is legit. He's not a great athlete, right? But he's super heady in terms of zone coverage. He's in the right place at the right time. And just the sheer length that he has, the ball skills, he will stay in guys' hip pockets. He's found that nice line of knowing how to be physical without being overly grabby. Because they play a lot of off zone, you're not gonna see him vulnerable over the top a whole lot, which would be the question with him is guys stacking him on the perimeter, and it just doesn't happen quite often with him. And he's just super comfortable at this point. He plays with this contagious confidence, and he's had a couple games where he's been the best player on the field. He was amazing in the Rams playoff game, for example. He's just a really good combination of a lot of the big kind of unathletic zone corners of years past. Even he's not Josh Norman, but the same idea of what Josh Norman was, what Rasul Douglas was for the Packers. Just someone that knows that, all right, I might get out athleted and give up a reception from time to time, but the short memory and the confidence to pair with size, smarts, and physicality, it's a really good number 2 corner, man. And his playmaking ability can change games at number 2. And then, J.C. Horn is just a supercharged version of that same description. Horn is not a lockdown cornerback. He takes his risks, especially. And he's not a super freak of an athlete. He's a very good athlete, but, good receivers, good quarterbacks, wrong place, wrong time. Horn has some bad games. He has games that he can take his losses, and unfortunately, there's an inconsistent aspect to his game in that sense. And you better believe he will grab if he needs to. He's been penalized 21 times over the last 2 seasons. But all cornerbacks are going to take their losses. And even if J.C. Horn loses more often than your typical ideal number one corner, the great games that J.C. Horn has and the moments he has that change games for a Panthers defense that has so desperately just needed playmakers and someone that can force turnovers and make shit happen, you'll so happily take that from what J.C. Horn has done. I mean, he had a couple of games last year that were just some of the best cornerback performances of the season. The Jets game and the Niners game especially. I mean, he had two insane interceptions against the Jets. One was just like teach tape, defending a fade technique where he's in the guy's hip pocket, gets his head around, makes a great catch. And then another one was like kind of more of that J.C. Horn concept of like, well, he's beat over the top, but the throw's a little late and he recovers and makes a great play on the ball. Like he kind of, two big interceptions that he made happen in that game. And then the Niners game, he I think made, I got to be careful when I say stuff like this, but I would say one of the 3 to 5 most impressive, memorable defensive plays of the entire season, where he abandons his assignment in cover 3. Again, that comfort running that coverage where they ran it half the time. He abandons his assignment because he knew there was no receivers coming into his area. And he picks off a backside dig from the opposite side. Brock Purdy read the coverage, expected cover 3 because they knew they had a 50% chance of getting it. The receiver was going to be wide open. And it's not even Brock Purdy's fault. You are not expecting the opposite side perimeter cover 3 corner to be undercutting a backside dig. And that is all just instincts, confidence, and zone IQ and football IQ. And J.C. Horn will change games with some of his big moments like that. So it's a really fun duo. They're not imperfect in terms of like coverage consistency necessarily. And, in some ways there is probably a reason they didn't run a lot of cover 1. I wouldn't trust Mike Jackson running a lot of cover 1, especially J.C. Horn. I think I would, but you would get a lot of penalties too. He'd probably be, in the kind of Charvarius Ward category in that sense, but it is at the end of the day one of the better cornerback duos, and they really drive the Panthers towards being a top half secondary in the league, because the rest of this, you honestly have a couple of question marks and a good player in Trayvon Merrick, but nothing special there. But let's talk about the slot corner here, which to me is a position battle. You have Chau Smith-Wade, who this team likes, but honestly just hasn't really played well. He plays hard and aggressive, and they respect that about him as a day 3 pick, but he's got deficiencies galore, whether it's coverage consistency, lack of run defense consistency, lack of traits and ball production. He's just been kind of what you expect, honestly, if you were to take a standard day 3 cornerback prospect and throw him in the slot and say good luck. It's kind of what Chau Smith-Wade has been. Corey Thornton, on the other hand, is probably more fascinating here. Now, right now, they're still listing Chau Smith-Wade as the starting slot corner, so we got to see if Corey Thornton can kind of win this job back. But Thornton was sort of a, fan favorite who was building up a lot of momentum to kind of be a slot corner, and he's fascinating. Undrafted slot corner who just does seem to have a little bit of a playmaking it factor about him. Entirely unproven in terms of doing that at a high level and being a good coverage player and all that. But I think you would hope Corey Thornton wins this job based on what we've seen from Chau Smith-Wade to this point. And if Corey Thornton can win that job, maybe we can start to talk about him as more of a solid, steady starting slot corner option. But right now, the lack of any answer in the slot is a huge reason why you have one of the better cornerback duos in the league, yet they only rank as the 15th overall secondary, for example. And your cornerback depth is pretty mediocre. A Caleb Evans is a journeyman speedster at this point. Will Lee was a 4th round pick. I didn't love Will Lee's tape just because there wasn't a whole lot that stood out to me. he does make sense. Like, he's in the same brand of Mike Jackson and JC Horn. Like, he's got size. I think he's smart and relatively physical. But just, you could tell like he wasn't a twitchy athlete. He just had decent speed, but nothing special. Hard to see him being a lockdown coverage player. His route to surprising would be similar to Mike Jackson surprising, where it's all his mind and instincts. I'm not going to say it can't happen, but I don't really see a path for him succeeding in year one as long as Horn and Jackson are healthy. Robert Rochelle, kind of special team depth and a bunch of undrafted type guys. So you're pretty thin at cornerback. You really are. Horn and Jackson are doing a lot of the heavy lifting there. But then you go to your safety room and you've got Trayvon Merrick, who I talked about in last year's deep dive. I think my analysis from that deep dive aged perfectly for like what he was for the Panthers. And basically what I said was it was an overpay for what he is and how he's played on the Raiders. I don't think it was this colossal loss for the Raiders. But what Trayvon Merrick does, which is play fast, hard, and tackles like really well from the back end, or just from the secondary generally, wherever you put him, he's kind of like a poor man's Budda Baker, where coverage production, honestly, like instincts, like I always got to be careful because Budda's a fan favorite, but the reality is he's like, really, you talk about safeties being right place, right time, just finding their ways to be around the ball. Like, Budda Baker's never really done that. Trayvon Merrick has had a severe lack of ball production throughout his career. He just doesn't seem to really get it from a coverage angle. But for a Panthers defense that in 2024 was gashed by big plays, missed tackles, and bad angles from the back end, Trayvon Merrick cleaned that up real quick and raised the floor of their overall defense in terms of just the definition of the position, not allowing big plays. Trayvon Merrick does that for you. So he's brought that to the table. And they moved him all over the place. He actually played a good bit as kind of that slot player, especially in their base defense, where they played a base defense about a quarter of the time. So Merrick was more of the strong safety in those looks, just being that physical presence around the box. And then, in that split safety assignment, he can really play anywhere, not going to give you a ton of consistency from a coverage standpoint. Maybe isn't going to bust a lot of coverages, like maybe a little bit more on the conservative end in terms of risk assessment and that kind of stuff, but he will prevent big plays from the back end. As long as other guys can make plays, that's totally reasonable. So Merrick's a nice piece here, but the other safety spot is a major question mark with Nick Scott, who I'll admit Scott played better last year than I definitely imagined he would. He didn't play well, I would say. He had 2 passes defended last season and continued to be a guy that just seems like he's getting beat a lot in coverage when you watch the Panthers play. But at least he, compared to his 2024 season with the Panthers, where he was a part of those like slow defenses on the back end that were giving up all these big plays, he missed 21% of his tackle attempts in the games he played in 2024. And in 2023, when he signed with the Bengals, he was at the heart of that conversation about like, how the hell did this team let Jesse Bates go and not replace him? And he was like a core liability for that 2023 Bengals defense. He's had some really bad years the last 2 years. Last year wasn't quite as bad, and the missed tackle rate was fine. 11%, not amazing, but wasn't the liability that Nick Scott has been known to be. He bounced back, but he's 31 years old and has largely been bad for 3 of the last 4 years. He's been really bad. He was a liability for the Rams in 2022 as well. So do I expect him to repeat at 31 years old? Maybe. Right now he's holding on to that starting job, but to me, I think maybe not for week 1, but as the season goes on, I would fully expect Nick Scott to be Nick Scott. Zakee Wheatley, as a 5th round pick, could really be your saving grace in terms of like newfound upside with this secondary. I was a huge fan of Zakee Wheatley. I had a 2nd to a 3rd round grade on him. They get him in the 5th round because, as we tend to see with a lot of safety prospects, if you don't run anything that starts with a 4.5, some of these teams will just forget about you. And Zakee Wheatley ran a 4.62. The thing is, his tape doesn't show me that. To me, Zakee Wheatley had one of the top minds among these safety prospects. It's way more important to be a step ahead and anticipate plays and react quickly than it is to be the difference between like a 4.55 guy and a 4.62. Like think of those, during the combine, they do the side by sides and they'll show like a 4.55 and a 4.6. You're talking about like not even a step, right? Like the difference between that amount of speed is so marginal and gets so overrated. If you're anticipating a full step ahead, you're fine. And there's been tons of safeties with low 4.5s, high 4.62 type of speed. And Wheatley's got really light feet. He actually reminded me a lot of times of what Malachi Starks was, where he's just quick as a cat. And even if the long speed, Starks was faster, but even if the long speed isn't amazing, his ability to kind of like react to route breaks and coverage or to dance around blockers at the line of scrimmage, like just instinctive quickness is all there with him. He's physical. He's got good size. He tackles. I think he can give you everything Nick Scott gives you and more. So I wouldn't be stunned if he wins this job as the season goes on. And I wouldn't be stunned if he emerges as, okay, maybe not a superstar, but can he be something like an Alohi Gilman? Or another guy that maybe comes to mind, sorry to go with another Packers comp here, but Evan Williams, another guy that I think ran like a 4.62, someone I missed on in the draft, but it sure as hell hasn't held him back. He's been a really good safety for the Packers. I see something like that with Zakee Wheatley. So I think that's better than Nick Scott if he can win this job. You do have like Lathan Ransom, Ohio State, heavy hitter, fan favorite. It was a pretty crazy moment when one of those little like scouting notes I had on Lathan Ransom came to fruition. I talked about how he leads with his head and is a headhunter and like leaves his feet as a tackler, and it shows up in his coverage tape as a run defender. He had a big moment where he actually speared Tyler Shuck, who slid a little late, but Ransom led with his helmet, and it's like, well, that was in the scouting report, and I memory is serving me right. I think it cost him that game, but he's a boomer bust like safety that I think as a dime safety is okay to have out there as a, when it's not a down to down thing, but it's like, hey, go head hunt, go try to get us a pick, go try to force a fumble. There's and go play special teams. Like there's worse depth than Lathan Ransom, but I don't want him starting consistently. Damani Richardson, Isaiah Simmons, kind of special teams depth. Isaiah Simmons was a really good special teams pickup for this team, so he'll be a gunner. He's one of the better gunners in the league at this point. For considering what he was as a prospect, it's good for him to like find a role. But there's your overall Panthers secondary. Largely, I think this group is what it is. Zakee Wheatley would provide some upside there, and then maybe Corey Thornton. But he's got to freaking win the starting slot job over Chow Smith Wade first. So I see a very high floor secondary for the most part that will probably finish around 15th here, assuming these guys stay healthy. Probably not a whole lot higher, not a whole lot worse. So that rounds out your Panthers defense here. And as you can imagine, they are pretty split with that D line being the way that it is. They're pretty split in terms of run defense versus pass defense. They rank 11th as a defense for run defense. I think they're going to do a really good job getting teams to third down, handling good run games, but the pass defense does rank 25th with a relative lack of pass rush. They have a solid secondary, but with some question marks back there. Yes, a really good cover linebacker unit relative to what the rest of the league has, but still, it's at that position group, it's hard to make a steady impact there. It's more about pass rush and secondary, right? So 25th for pass defense, not putrid, but lower compared to stacking it up against the rest of the league. And as an overall defense, I do have the Panthers above where they finished last year. They were about 24th-ish as a defense last year. This year, 18th for defense, trending in the right direction. And if Ejiro Evero can be who I hope he can be, you hit some green lights with this defense. That's what I'm kind of talking about and talked about in the coach and scheme segment is can we now see a top half of the league defense in Carolina for the first time, certainly in a long time. I think is cautious optimism that the Panthers could get there. But let's talk some special teams. And as far as offseason changes, nothing going there. Same specialists in place here. So that's Ryan Fitzgerald, who's going to rank towards the bottom of the league as a kicker, 27th. Sam Martin's a decent punter. Their return game is pretty shaky right now with some young guys that got to prove it, most notably Trevor Etienne. Maybe he can show something more there, but the Panthers actually ranked tied for last amidst returners. They had some of the worst return game in the league last year. I also look at their PFF and DVOA team grades from last year, where they were right about 20th last year. So they came out as the 26th ranked special teams. I would say this is one of the lower projections for a special teams that the Panthers get here. And I would imagine there's probably going to be some inconsistencies with them in that phase, would be my guess. But special teams is hard to predict, and that's why it doesn't get a huge part of the equation here. But let's start tying a ribbon on this deep dive. We're going to recap strengths, weaknesses, and most importantly, the pivotal factors. And then we'll get into more prediction territory here, taking a look at the schedule and do some superlative award picks for the Panthers. But when I look at the Panthers, I think what stands out to me is the general lack of weaknesses. I think they've done a really good job building a high floor team here in Carolina. To me, the biggest weakness, and really the only weakness of note, is going to be that pass rush. I get it. It's better than it's been, but I think it's still a weakness, especially when you compare it to the rest of the league. But the edge rushers do show up in that middle category, the wild cards, the pivotal factors. If Jalen Phillips can stay healthy, if Nick Scorton can take another step forward, not a guarantee that either of those things happen, but if they do both happen, I don't think pass rush will be a huge weakness. I still think you're going to want more, but maybe it can just be okay. And then you're left with a team that hopefully won't have any true weaknesses. But you have some other wild cards as well, the biggest of which is Bryce Young, who, league-wide is closer to a weakness than a strength at quarterback. They ranked 22nd there. So big fourth year for Bryce, as we talked about. Hopefully that can get closer to being a strength for the Panthers. That would be great. Certainly not a given. Running back, as we detailed, is probably the most volatile group on this team in terms of what you're going to get. There's a chance that running back drops into being a weakness, but it could be even more of a legitimate strength as well. So there's a wide range of outcomes with that running back room. And in turn, the run game overall. And then I think pass catchers too, like it's not a weakness with where I looked at it. They ranked 23rd to 27th heading into the season. But with the Panthers, like heading into the year, that's almost an irrelevant ranking because it's all about these young receivers, T-Mac and Coker especially, checking boxes and being more consistent and climbing those rankings. Like that duo could be special. Pass catchers could be closer to a strength than it is a non-strength as it is right now, essentially. But I do see for the Panthers some legitimate strengths that are already existing as we head into the year. I think pass protection, absolutely, should still be really good. They've got a lot of pieces to work with there. The D-line run defense undoubtedly is one of the best in the league. And then linebacker coverage, for whatever that is worth, this is one of the better linebacker duos in terms of taking stuff away over that part of the field. Even if naturally at that position, it's still going to be inconsistent, even if you're one of the best in the league at it. But with that picture painted, let's get into more prediction territory for me. But we'll take a look at their schedule and some of their gambling odds before I give you my final win prediction on the Panthers. It's not an easy schedule. That works against the Panthers. They did draw in a division that had a three-way tie. On the plus side, they got to make the playoffs. On the downside, they get a first place schedule. So they're going to end up with more challenging opponents than teams like the Saints and Falcons and even the Bucs in this very tight NFC South. And that probably is factoring into the fact that the betting market has the Panthers actually fourth in odds for this division. For me, they're the second highest ranked team, right? We already did the Falcons. We already did the Saints. It's close. But I do think the schedule bakes into where people are placing their money and how these odds get established. So that explains a little bit why they fell down to fourth. And their over-under is a little bit lower than these previous teams as well. Their over-under is it's either 6.5, but if you bet the over, you make no money, or it's 7.5, and if you bet the under, you make no money. So it's essentially a 7-win over-under. And based on how the math shakes out with their schedule, I think that's right. I mean, there's really just not a lot of gimmies. Realistically, your worst opponent is going to be Cleveland, and you have to go to Cleveland. And then outside of their own division, which has a couple of close-ranked teams, there's not another opponent on their schedule that, for example, I've already ranked in this deep dive series. So you're just getting basically every single week either divisional matchups with playoff stakes on the line in this NFC South that should be tight again, or you're getting playoff caliber opponents, whether it's in the NFC or the AFC. So if the Panthers are going to hit some green lights and be a better football team this year than they were last year, they're going to have to bring it every single week, man. So this is a really challenging schedule. And I do think that ultimately is going to work against them to an extent. I do generally really like what this team is building. I believe in the coaching staff and the depth of this team, the really the width of this team in many ways, like the lack of weaknesses. I think they're a very high floor team. For me, their floor is 6 wins, even with this schedule. But with the schedule and I think there is still a relative lack of superstar talent scattered throughout this Panthers team. I think the ceiling is probably a little bit lower as well. I've got them as a 9-win ceiling. And for my win prediction on the Panthers, I've got them winning 8 games this year. And I think the biggest difference for me between if it was going to be 7 wins or 8 wins, I do think the clutch factor on Bryce Young matters. I think this team is going to play in a lot of close games, and they have a certain experience at this point finding ways to pull those games out after last year, and a quarterback that can do that for you. So there's a lot to like about this Panthers team. I don't know that there's a lot to love about this Panthers team, which to me makes the 22nd ranking make a lot of sense. They have really been building this thing up from the ground, and they've done an excellent job at doing that. They are real boys again. They're in the mix for playoff contention. Which, if you told a Panthers fan that 2 years ago, after the Frank Reich year, they would have said, "Please give me that in 2 years." But you definitely see some of the residual effects of there's still stuff to figure out here in Carolina as well. But let's finish up with my superlative team awards. So for team MVP, which for me is a non-quarterback award, I don't know if I would give it to Bryce Young or not, even if we were picking quarterbacks, but I'm going to back Tetairoa McMillan here. I just said it, that there's not a lot of real superstar talent on this Panthers team that would raise the ceiling of this team. I think Tetairoa McMillan has a chance this year if Bryce can be good enough, if the passing game infrastructure can be good enough, T-Mac to establish himself at least as like a top 10 superstar wide receiver, create some of that extra hype and the concept of upside for this team, and also just be a driver of this offense and walk out of the year like that's the best player on the Panthers. So that's why I went with T-Mac. For biggest wild card, and again, non-quarterback pick here, it would be Bryce Young. That's why I don't pick quarterbacks, because it would be a quarterback for pretty much every team. But I cheated a little bit. I just said the edge room. I think with everything we said about the pass rush, if they have a chance of being at least a decent pass rush outside of when they're scheming it up with Ejiro Evero, who does a good job at it, I think you need Phillips to stay healthy and just be a good number 2 player, which he can be if he's healthy, and you need Nick Scorton to kind of reach that level. Some of the worst pass rushes in the league that are still acceptable have 2 number 2s. That's your path to having 2 number 2s, is that combination of things happens. But it's a wild card in the sense of if Scorton doesn't take a step and Phillips gets hurt, you're kind of back to square one. So that's a pretty easy sell as the biggest wild card, even if it's kind of cheating to pick 2 players there. Breakout offense, I do believe in the Jonathan Brooks thing. I do. I think he was such a high floor prospect. It just comes down to the injury, right? And I'm kind of fading Chuba a little bit. That's a guy that dealt with some pretty serious injuries coming out. He's had a pretty heavy workload to this point in his career. I could see that being kind of like, he's still a good player, but as Brooks really emerges, if he's healthy, like that being a breakout kind of star player, maybe. He's my pick there. Breakout defense was a tough one. I thought about Trevin Wallace. I did. I don't know how much if these are more predictions and what I'm picking, I want to believe I do. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to pick it though. He was my next option, but I actually went with Corey Thornton just to kind of like win that job and be like a decent slot corner. I don't think he's going to break out as a star. It's kind of hard to find that guy on this defense. I mean, maybe Nick Scorton as well, but like I don't know that Nick Scorton has like that much more room to like really break out for what we kind of talked about there. Unsung hero, this is where I'm going to give Derek Brown some more love because it is true. He's not this great pass rusher. He's not going to get a lot of the accolades that more of the pass rushing DTs get. But he just might be the nastiest run defender in the NFL and still to this day does a lot of dirty work for this team that goes underappreciated quite often. And then fantasy MVP, that's where I went with Jonathan Brooks. There are some people starting to buy stock on him. He's going as RB36 right now. But if I think this running back room could play out the way I envision and he kind of takes over, he could be a potential like league winner. And we saw last year, this staff, if one option is better than the other, they will ride the hot hand. Even if Chuba is paid and a locker room hero for this team, if Brooks just looks better and is better for them, they will ride him out. So I'm kind of buying the Jonathan Brooks thing this year. I really am. But that is going to do it for this Panthers deep dive, your 22nd ranked Carolina Panthers. Let me know in the comments down below with 3 out of 4 NFC South teams previewed. Do the Panthers win the NFC South? Let me know there. Let me know who you think comes next with the number 21 ranking in these deep dives. Thank you so much for watching. Please do hit that like button if you have not yet. I really appreciate it. If you are one of our podcast listeners as well, if you have a second to leave a review, that's really the only way to help things grow on Spotify or iTunes, wherever it is. So I appreciate you taking a second there, whether you're sitting on the airplane, sitting on the toilet, in an Uber or wherever it is. If you've got a second to leave a review, I really do appreciate it. Preferably a 5-star one, but if you hate me, then I get it. But yeah, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and we'll talk soon. Cheers.